4. Dixie's Delight. In July 1953, Elvis was reading the afternoon paper, the Memphis Press Scimitar, when he noticed a lengthy article that seemed to speak his name. 3 years earlier, 27-year-old Sam Phillips had opened the Memphis recording service at 706 Union Avenue. It was only about a 10-minute walk from the Peabody Hotel, where Phillips and one part-time assistant, a woman named Marion Keisker, worked for Memphis's top radio station WREC. Phillips had become an announcer there in 1945, but he held a number of duties, including engineering the big band broadcasts of Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey and Glenn Miller on a network hookup from the Peabody Skyway each Saturday night. It was glamorous, mirrored ballroom kind of work, but in his new outlet, the Florence, Alabama native who had grown up destitute on a tenant farm alongside black workers intended to spotlight the opposite end of the social strata. Largely through his burgeoning Sun Records, located in the same small building, Phillips hoped to create a commercial market for rhythm and blues, the real rhythm and blues, the kind they sang over in West Memphis, Arkansas, in the cotton fields and in the back parlors of Beale Street. Phillips would later say he was looking for Negro artists of the South who wanted to make a record but had no place to go. As Keisker noted, there had never been an opportunity in Memphis for a Negro to get into a record company. Negroes weren't even allowed to perform in white clubs. In essence, Phillips sold hope to people who had none. Somehow or another, deep down in my soul, I guess I just had an affinity for music and people, especially people who had the ability to express themselves, but didn't have the opportunity to go to New York or Chicago and try to get somebody to listen to them. I didn't want to work with anybody except untried and unproven talent, and I just had a desire to work with black people. The idea was both revolutionary and unpopular, and there was vitriol in some of the comments he got from his coworkers at the radio station. Some of my best friends would kid me, say I smelled that morning when I came in, and ask why I would leave the Peabody and go out and start recording niggers. But Phillips had a fiercely independent heart. He began with men whose names would be legendary: B.B. King, Joe Hill Lewis, and soon Howlin' Wolf. In 1951, with Ike Turner's band sitting in, he produced singer Jackie Brenston's Rocket 88, probably the first rock and roll record. Phillips lived for the creativity of the studio. He loved seeing what people would come up with in the exchange of energy in the room and getting sound down on tape. He could alter sound with acoustics and engineering tricks, and in 1954, using 2 Ampex 350 recorders, developed a tape delay echo, or slapback technique, to make the music sound real alive, as he put it. But the dynamics had to be created out of the musicians themselves. The worst thing you can do is overproduce. And he could pull things out of them that even they never knew were there. A slight man at the time, he weighed only 125 pounds, the black-haired Phillips was so charismatic that when he got talking in a big way, his rhetoric, half preaching, half reminiscence, had an almost mystical quality. None of these people that I recorded had ever had any experience. Some of them had never really seen a broadcast-type microphone. Most of them certainly had never seen a recording studio, and I kind of liked that. A homespun genius with an integral understanding of the blues, Phillips also had a mission: to cross the racial divide. His idea was to mix the music of the black man with the country sounds he'd grown up hearing all around him in Alabama. The first record his family owned was a 78 RPM of Jimmie Rodgers, and on such radio stations as Nashville's WSM. He knew that great music, and it was great music he was always after, defied easy categorization. And if he could find a musician who wedded Southern white and black gospel to country and blues, well, he'd have an act like no other. It might also help him pay the $150 a month rent on his little 20 by 35-foot storefront studio, which was often a struggle, especially with the $8 or $10 for electricity. Phillips had come up as the youngest of 8 kids, and he lost his father early, seeing his dream of becoming a criminal defense lawyer go up in smoke. But the music business had nearly killed him too. In 1949, he'd had a nervous breakdown, but I got off my back after 10 shock treatments, and I was back working in a couple of months. Less than that, because I had just worked myself to death with a lot of responsibility for a young person. Now that he had small children, he didn't want to put himself at risk like that again. He needed a commercial act, and he needed it soon. Though it was never really money that drove Sam, Marion knew the refrain. Over and over I heard Sam say, if I could find a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel, I could make $1 billion. The newspaper story Elvis read on July 15th headlined, "Prison singers may find fame with record they made in Memphis," focused on Phillips's newest find, the Prisonaires. Phillips had transported the quartet from the Tennessee State Penitentiary under armed guard, bringing them to his studio on Union, where they recorded an original song, "Just Walkin' in the Rain." Phillips would release the song on Sun Records, with its bright yellow label depicting a spindly rooster greeting the day, music notes forming a circle around Sun Record Company and its location, Memphis, Tennessee. By 1953, Phillips was already expanding his original intent with Sun, working with white artists as well as black. Meanwhile, his bread-and-butter business, the Memphis Recording Service, was scrambling, too, advertising that we record anything, anywhere, anytime. Phillips wasn't kidding. He'd lug the equipment out to weddings and bar mitzvahs or make dubs, transfer tapes. In short, do anything to keep the doors open. His first big financial outlay was a neon sign in the window, which he hoped would lure drop-in customers. But parking was always a problem because of the way the streets formed a triangle, the building tucked behind the intersection of Union and Marshall, with Taylor's restaurant next door. Elvis would have noticed the newspaper story immediately, as would everyone else in his household, both for the word prison in the headline — no one could pretend to forget that Vernon had done his time — and for the novelty of such a recording service. Sometime that summer, 1953, Elvis, who worked as an assembler at the M.B. Parker Company until the end of July, when the job ran out, took his guitar over to Union and plunked down $4 to make a 2-sided acetate of My Happiness and the ink spots, That's When Your Heartaches Begin. Marion, a bespectacled, blonde, 35-year-old divorcee who handled all the distributor relationships, bookkeeping, publicity, billing, and secretarial work — I was the entire office — was swamped that day. But she vividly remembered Elvis, a fidgety boy looking for a break. He came on a Saturday afternoon, a very busy afternoon. For some reason, I happened to be alone at the time. The office was full of people wanting to make personal records. I told him he would have to wait, and he said he would. Of course, he had his guitar, so while he was waiting, we had a conversation. He asked if anybody needed a singer. He said, "Somebody out there must want to hear me." I said, "What kind of singer are you?" He said, "Well, I sing all kinds." I said, "Who do you sound like?" And he said, "Like nobody. I don't sound like nobody." It was true, of course, but it seemed so impossible. Marion went back to make the 10-inch acetate, and halfway through the first side, she thought she heard what Sam was looking for — this Negro sound in a white man. Quickly, She grabbed a piece of recording tape and threaded it through the 2-track Ampex. This was not something we did with drop-in business, but I wanted Sam to hear this. He was out at the time, and the only tape I could find was crumbly, and it was broken by the time I got it set up. I got maybe a third of the first song and all of the second song. When Sam came back, I played it for him, and he was impressed and said he would do something, but the boy would take a lot of work. He said, "Did you get his name and address?" And I said, "Yes." I had this slip for many years. It said, "Elvis Presley, good ballad singer." Sam would remember the events differently than Marion did, saying he was there that first day and set up the disc-cutting machine himself. The boy was so unsure of himself that Sam found it hard to believe he'd ever performed for an audience. He tried not to show it, but he felt so inferior. Elvis was probably, innately, the most introverted person that ever came into that studio. He liked Elvis's recording, though, and told him he was about to go over to the penitentiary in Nashville to see about the prisoners. He'd visit publisher Red Wortham while he was in town, and if Sam found any material he thought was fitting for Elvis, he'd give him a call. Whether Sam confused his second visit with the first, Elvis returned to the Memphis recording service in January 1954 to make a second acetate, this time of 2 country tunes, "I'll Never Stand in Your Way" and "It Wouldn't Be the Same Without You." Again, Elvis got his hopes up, prayed to hear back from Marion or Mr. Phillips. He always called Sam Mr. Phillips, though he addressed Marion by her first name. But nothing happened. Marion couldn't get him out of her mind, though. She almost felt as if she had discovered him. He brought out her maternal instincts, and she'd even mentioned him to her own mother. "Oh, I've seen him on the streetcar," her mother said. "The kid with the long sideburns. I wondered what in the world he was." That month, as Elvis turned 19, he began attending the First Assembly of God on Macklemore Avenue in South Memphis. He'd been there before. The church chartered 3 city buses on Sunday mornings to ride through the housing projects and bring worshipers to the services. Aside from his schooling at Ellis Auditorium, it was here that Elvis first learned to love white gospel music, and it was the home church for the Blackwood Brothers Quartet. There was also another connection, Cecil Blackwood, a nephew of founding member James Blackwood, lived in the courts with his new wife, and he was just getting up a sort of apprentice quartet he called the Songfellows. Elvis fantasized about joining them one day, so he figured it wouldn't hurt to show up in the pews. The church had another draw, too. For the last 10 years, Reverend James E. Hamill had presided over the church with firm leadership, growing the congregation to nearly 2,000 members. A fire and brimstone preacher who encouraged fervent demonstrations of faith, such as speaking in tongues, Reverend Hamill was nonetheless well-educated and cautious and thoughtful in his counseling of members for problems big and small. He carried himself with a demeanor that was both serious and benevolent, and his parishioners revered him as a second father, wise, kind, and good. For a boy whose daddy lazed around most of the time and let his wife steamroll him in nearly every way, Reverend Hamill was an appealing figure. However, it wasn't spiritual soothing Elvis desired in early 1954, but rather romantic salvation. He and his cousin Jean were looking for a way to meet girls. On Sunday, January 24th, Elvis, with a wavy new Tony perm in his hair, attended a function at the church. He caught the eye of a young church secretary, the teenage Dixie Locke. She took one look at him and, for a minute, almost stopped breathing. He was the most gorgeous thing I'd ever seen. Dixie got within earshot, and speaking a little louder than usual to be sure Elvis would hear, made plans with a girlfriend to go skating at the Rainbow Roller Dome on Saturday night. The next weekend, sure enough, he showed up, but in nobody's idea of a roller skating outfit. A ruffled shirt and black pegged pants with a pink stripe down the sides, topped with a bolero jacket. At first, Dixie pretended she didn't know he was there, waiting to see if he would approach her. But after he huddled by the rail for too long, it dawned on her that he couldn't skate. She felt sorry for him now and went over and said, "Hi, I'm Dixie from church." He got shy on her and said, "Yeah, I know," and looked down for a minute, and then tossed his hair back a little. It was the first time they had spoken, but then they almost didn't stop. They got a Coke and talked nearly the night away, telling each other their life stories. Already they were moony over each other, and when it came time to go home, they extended their date at Kay's drive-in for a late-night snack. Afterward, Dixie kissed him in the parking lot, and he drove her home. Very late now, her father would kill her, in his '41 Lincoln. The next night, and the next, they went to the movies. But she still didn't want her parents to see him. Not yet. I had tried to tell my mom and dad about him, that he was a little different from the other guys. But when he arrived at the house the next Saturday night, only a week since they first talked at the roller skating rink, she was not prepared for the reaction. My parents were so shocked at the way he looked and dressed that they wouldn't let us leave together. They spent the evening sitting on the front porch with her 3 sisters and her mom and dad. In time, her family adored him. He was a perfect gentleman. But one of her sisters kept raising her eyebrows so Dixie could see what she really thought of the guy. And her uncle offered Elvis $2 to go get a crew cut. Dark-haired, intelligent, and earnest, Dixie was everything Elvis wanted in a girlfriend. Even her age was right. A sophomore at Southside High, Dixie was 14 years old. Almost immediately, Elvis gave her his ring and taught her the language, almost a baby talk, he had with his mother, reverting to a pouty little boy voice when he used their special words. When Dixie first saw him at church, we knew almost immediately he was not one of us. There was a restlessness about him, an air of anticipation, as if he knew he was on the threshold of something wonderful and exciting. Part of it was his nervousness at what might come of his visits to the Memphis recording service, if anything. He hadn't even told Dixie about making the record, and he was glad because he hadn't heard back from Marion or Sam. But that didn't mean he wouldn't, did it? He had so much unfocused energy. When he sat, he drummed his fingers on the table, and his foot was just going all the time, shaking, tapping, as if he hadn't a second to waste. His leg, too, just bounced, even when he was just sitting in the movie theater. If anyone commented on it, he'd stammer and say, "Oh, I just do that. I just do that." He was settling into the church now, partly to be closer to Dixie. He participated in many of the activities, and he hoped to impress her with his singing. Though Dixie found him a shy boy, when he sang, he threw himself into it completely, so much so that she thought he kind of lost himself. And he had this feeling if he could just meet James Blackwood, it would be worth every feeling of insecurity. He was much more relaxed when they went for walks. He could be playful, too. He'd grab her from behind, his hands around her waist, and hug her up close, snuggling into her back. Dixie would let out a delighted squeal, her dimples showing, and then smile so big folks could probably see it all the way over in Nashville. Soon the young couple was nearly inseparable. Elvis and Dixie were falling in love. It was serious right away, she says. In fact, they considered marriage. We knew that that was what was supposed to be. We talked about it from the very beginning. Elvis, too, would always remember how close the two came to marriage. "I got out of school and was driving a truck," he said in a 1972 interview. "I was dating a girl and waiting for her to get out of school so we could get married." Yet even so, past loves were still on his mind. Billy Wardlaw, who had moved to Mississippi from the courts, was back living in Memphis again and going to school at Tech High. Just as before, Elvis started showing up at places he knew she would be. I came out of Tech one afternoon and there he was, under the trees on campus picking his guitar. But Elvis could see Billy still didn't care for him, not with the deep passion he held for her. He knew for sure now that it was time to move on. 2 weeks after he and Dixie met, Elvis took her home to meet his parents, and soon after, the Locks invited the Presleys for dinner. Dixie was surprised at their family dynamics, at how Vernon, who was on disability a good portion of the time, was almost an outsider. If Elvis ever stepped out of line, she noticed that Gladys handled it, not Vernon. If it was okay with Gladys, then it was okay with Vernon. He was not a disciplinarian by any means, and he knew that bond that Gladys and Elvis had for each other, something I felt he was not allowed to be a part of. It almost seemed like Elvis and his mom made more of the decisions, and Mr. Presley just kind of went along. I think he knew that Gladys and Elvis really called the shots. When Elvis and Dixie first got together, Gladys took a more protective stance, as if to make sure Elvis didn't get his heart broken like he did with Billy Wardlaw. She saw that Dixie was a quality girl, and as Elvis had suggested, potential marriage material, despite the 5-year age difference. Soon, when Dixie was at the house, Gladys began asking her probing questions about her family and how high I was up in the church, and have I done this, and where have I gone? I felt a little like I was being interrogated. Dixie's father did the same thing with boys who came to call on her 3 sisters, so she wasn't offended. In fact, she and Gladys developed a deep friendship. She told us several times that she would rather he married me than anyone else he had dated, and Gladys wanted him married. She was gaining a lot of weight and not feeling well, and she wanted him settled and happy in case something happened to her. But Dixie also saw that the bond between mother and son was formidable and not likely to be broken. The Bible teaches that it's God's plan to leave your father and mother. She was well aware of that, but I don't know that that would have ever happened with them. In retrospect, she believes that had they both lived their full lifespans, they would have been together. I don't think he would have ever left her, regardless of the situation. She would always have been with him. In all probability, Dixie, Elvis, and Gladys would have had a living arrangement much like that of Gladys, Vernon, and Minnie May, together until death. Nonetheless, the 4 of them, Elvis, Dixie, Gladys, and Vernon, began doing things together, getting a bite to eat, and then going to the all-night gospel singings at Ellis Auditorium. Gladys loved the Blackwood Brothers best, but Elvis preferred the more flamboyant statesmen, thrilling to Jake Hess's forceful lead stylings, and the lake-bottom low notes of bass singer Jim Big Chief Wetherington, whose legs often shook inside his big loose pants when he sang. Elvis just couldn't get enough of music, and he was discovering the wealth of what Memphis had to offer. On Sundays, he and Dixie would sometimes slip away from their own church services to go to the all-black East Trigg Baptist Church just a few blocks away. There, they'd sit in the balcony and let the waves of black gospel wash over them, get baptized in the beat of the Lord. Already, Elvis was thinking of a way to meld black and white gospel together. But there was no gospel like black gospel, with its near physicality, and East Trigg's pastor, the Reverend Herbert Brewster, was no ordinary preacher. A celebrated civil rights activist and fiery orator, he was also an accomplished gospel songwriter. Mahalia Jackson would record his Move On Up a Little Higher, and Clara Ward his How I Got Over. By spring 1954, Elvis was driving a truck for Crown Electric, delivering supplies for $1 an hour, and training to be an electrician. Sometimes they would let me help wire or something. Though, as he said in a 1956 interview, he worried if he were cut out for it. You had to keep your mind right on what you're doing. You can't be the least bit absent-minded, or you're liable to blow somebody's house up. I didn't think I was the type for it, but I was going to give it a try. Things were looking up, on the whole, and he and Dixie were seeing each other almost every day. That May, they attended the Oral Roberts Crusade, though most of their dates were less serious-minded. They'd climb in the old Lincoln and head off to the movies 2 or 3 times a week, or go down to the WMPS radio studios at the corner of Union and Main for DJ Bob Neal's High Noon Roundup show, where the Blackwoods appeared regularly. On the other end of the scale, they also loved Dewey Phillips's Red, Hot, and Blue radio show for its mix of blues, boogies, and spirituals. The couple would listen to it in Elvis's car, parked at McKellar Lake, or maybe over at his parents' house. Dixie was more a fan of Perry Como and Frank Sinatra, but the WHBQ show was the hottest in town for black and white teenagers alike. Phillips, wild, wacky, and often hopped up on amphetamines, called himself Daddy-O, and he struck fear in the hearts of legions of God-fearing Memphians. So many of our Christian parents wouldn't even let their children listen to it, Dixie remembers. Phillips's broadcasts often spurred Elvis to drop by Charlie's record shop on North Main to peruse the new R&B records, Dixie in tow. Elvis had gotten brave one day and talked the proprietor into putting his first acetate on the jukebox. And man, that was a thrill. Elvis needed a boost about then, too. He'd tried out for the Songfellows and was crushed at the rejection, hearing over and over in his head that they'd said he couldn't sing, when what they had really said was that he couldn't sing harmony. And he was rejected as a vocalist with the Eddie Bond Band at the Hi-Hat Club, Bond telling him to go back to driving a truck. Years later, his words still stung. Man, Elvis would tell George Klein, that son of a bitch broke my heart. It was a delicate period in all their lives. The more time that Elvis and Dixie spent together, the more Dixie sensed that Gladys felt slighted, even though she seemed like a second mother. The two shared recipes and went places together, once to a Stanley Products party, the Tupperware of the early 1950s, or simply spent hours talking. They never had crosswords. But even as a teenager, it seemed to Dixie that Gladys was almost jealous of her relationship with Elvis. She and I were real close and enjoyed each other, but I think if she had been able to, she would have just kept him to herself. I felt that way myself. I would have kept him just for me and not let the world have him. Marian Keisker went to work one day in mid-1954 and found that Sam had pulled out the note she'd made months earlier. Elvis Presley, good ballad singer. "What's this for?" she asked him, and smiled at the funny memo she'd made, Timothy Sideburns, to remind her what Elvis looked like. "Oh," Sam said, "that kid was in here again. I liked him, but I don't have time to work with him. I told him I would call him sometime." As Marian told the story, every time a song would come up and Sam would say, "Who should we get?" she'd say, "The kid with the sideburns. Why don't we give him a chance?" But Sam would invariably say, "Oh, I don't think he's ready yet." Elvis still persisted, though, dropping by periodically. Finally, in June 1954, he got his break. Sam had a new song from Nashville, a ballad called Without You. Marian placed the call, and Sam got on the line and gave him the good news. The studio was 10 or 12 blocks from Alabama Street, and Elvis ran all the way, Sam said. "I no more than hung up the phone hardly, and he was there in no time flat." Without a doubt, Sam loved the plaintiveness in his voice, the yearning for lost dreams. But no matter how many times Elvis sang Without You, he never quite got it to Sam's satisfaction. He sang it well, but I said to myself, we just can't do a ballad on Elvis. We were taking a break, Marian remembered, and Sam said, "What can you do?" Elvis said, "I can sing anything." Sam said, "Let me hear you." So he just started playing snatches, gospel, western, anything, doing real heavy on the Dean Martin stuff. He must have been convinced if he was going to sound like somebody, he was going to sound like Dean Martin. The three of us stayed there far into the night, just Elvis playing and talking. Elvis recalled the same thing to Bob Johnson of the Memphis Press Scimitar in 1956. "I guess I must have sat there at least 3 hours. I sang everything I knew, pop stuff, spirituals, just a few words of anything I remembered." Sam prided himself on his ability to read people and to coax the best out of them. "There is not a human being on the face of God's earth who could get more out of totally untrained musicians than me." Now he looked out the control room window and locked eyes with Elvis, who searched Phillips's own for reassurance. Elvis knew the whole thing was a disaster, but maybe they would hit on something. "You're doing just fine. Now just relax. Let me hear something that really means something to you," Sam said, trying to get the boy to communicate whatever was in his heart. "If you make a mistake of any sort, I don't care what it is. I want a big one. If you hold back, you'll kill the feel of the whole damn thing." 3 days after Elvis's big audition, his world fell apart. R.W. Blackwood and Bill Lyles of the Blackwood Brothers Quartet were killed in a plane crash in Alabama. Elvis drove straight to Dixie's after work, and they cried in each other's arms. To Elvis, Bill and R.W. were more than great singers. They were friends now, from church. But Dixie had known the whole family for years, and these were close deaths. She and Elvis held hands at the funeral on July 2nd, which was all the more emotional because the Locks were leaving for a 2-week family vacation in Florida the next day. It was the first time Elvis and Dixie would be separated. They'd talked several times about eloping, and now they discussed it again before she left, since Dixie was scheduled to start her summer job at Goldsmith's department store when she returned. But she was so young, she knew it would break her parents' hearts if they ran away and got married. Of course, they were not intimate. The church frowned on premarital sex, and they wouldn't have done it anyway. They were saving themselves for marriage. The night Dixie left, Elvis got a phone call from Scotty Moore, a local guitarist whose band, the Starlight Wranglers, had just signed with Sun Records. Elvis had mentioned to Sam that he was looking for a band, and Sam had passed the word along. The Starlight Wranglers already had a lead singer, Doug Poindexter. But Scotty, whose day job was cleaning and blocking hats in his brother's laundry business, had been working with Sam for several months, trying to come up with a record, an artist, a song, anything they could make a buck out of, as Scotty said. Elvis's name came up, and Sam gave Scotty his number. He showed up at Scotty's house on a Sunday afternoon, the 4th of July, wearing a black shirt, pink pants with white stripes down the leg, white shoes, and just a lot of hair. I thought my wife was going to go out the back door. Bill Black, who played bass for the Starlight Wranglers when he wasn't building tires at Firestone, lived down the street, and he came too for a few hours. The three sang everything they could think of, though they had little repertoire in common. They made an odd trio. Elvis, 19, with grease in his hair, looking like a space-age garage mechanic. Scotty, 23, quiet and unassuming, with sloping features that spoke to a country background. And the jocular Black, 28, whose soft body nearly ran to fat, and who held his bass together with baling wire. Afterwards, Scotty got on the phone to Sam. "Well, the boy sings pretty good, but he didn't knock me out." "Well, what do you think? Do we need a song or what?" Sam said. Scotty thought for a minute and then replied, "Yeah, with the right song, I think he would be good on record." The next night, they were all in Sam's little 2-room studio for what was supposed to be basically a rehearsal. The first song Elvis put down on tape was the Leon Payne ballad, "I Love You Because," and then he sang a couple of country numbers. They were all right, but not special, so they took a break and got some coffee and a Coke while Sam monkeyed with the console. Then Elvis remembered an old, loose-jointed Arthur Big Boy Crudup song, "That's All Right, Mama," that he'd heard on Dewey Phillips's show. Crudup was a man apart. His music didn't follow standard black blues patterns. A mile-wide hillbilly streak ran through it, which is probably what commended it to Elvis. Now he picked up a guitar and banged on it and started singing, keeping the primal energy of Crudup's recording, but hopping up the vocal, jumping around the studio in a dance, just cutting up to break the tension. Bill picked up his bass and started slapping the strings, helping the beat along, and clowning too. And then Scotty tried to get in somewhere with a rhythm vamp. They were just making a bunch of racket, as Scotty saw it, not realizing they were striking rock's seminal lightning bolt. The door to the control room was open, and about halfway through, Sam came running out saying, "Wait a minute, what the devil are y'all doing? That sounds pretty good through the door." Everybody looked at each other like, what were we doing? We said, "We don't know." Sam said, "Well, find out real quick and don't lose it. Run through it again and let's see what it sounds like." "Sam," Scotty said. It just flipped him. He thought it was real exciting. They backtracked, playing it twice, once for Sam to get a balance. Elvis ran the words again in his head and changed Crudup's line. "The life you're living, son, women be the death of you," to, "Son, that gal you're fooling with, she ain't no good for you." Then they put it on tape. That one simple action set the wheels in motion to make Elvis Presley the most important star of all time. The following day, Sam called Dewey Phillips and told him he had an acetate he wanted him to hear. They sat together and listened at the WHBQ studios at the Hotel Chiska, and Dewey jumped out of his seat, wanting to know who it was. Nobody would believe Elvis was a white boy, not sounding like this. Dewey played the song on the air July 8th, and the switchboard lit up. So he spun it over and over, finally calling Gladys and Vernon and asking them to get Elvis into the studio. He wanted to interview him on the air. Elvis had been too nervous to listen, so he went to the movies to try to take his mind off it. The Presleys went to the Suzor No. 2 and combed the dark aisles, peering into the long rows of faces until they found their son. Down at the station, Dewey could tell how rattled Elvis was, so he just made casual conversation with him, never telling him he was on the air until it was over. Sam Phillips, awed by the reaction, knew he'd finally found a white man with the black sound and called the trio into the studio the next night. He needed a second side to release a single, but the problem was finding something in the same vein, as Elvis seemed stuck on ballads. Again, the guys ran through every song they could think of, and then Bill took off on Bill Monroe's bluegrass waltz, Blue Moon of Kentucky. He rendered it as a kind of goof, souping up the tempo with a rhythm and blues feel, and mimicking Monroe's high, lonesome tenor as he slapped the bass. Elvis joined in, scrubbing the rhythm on his acoustic guitar, and then Scotty laid down his clean lines on the electric. "Hell, that's different. That's a pop song now, nearly bowed," Sam Phillips famously enthused. "We just sort of shook our heads and said, 'Well, that's fine, but good God, they'll run us out of town,'" Scotty remembers. "I think we all knew immediately when this happened that this might be what we was looking for. So we just figured out where to start and stop, and that was it." By this time, Dixie knew that Elvis had been recording at Sun Records, but she was shocked to get a telegram from him on vacation. "Hurry home, my record is doing great." Then, as the family drove back into Memphis, they heard Blue Moon of Kentucky on the radio. It was one thing to hear three guys sitting in the kitchen practicing a song with a couple of guitars, Dixie said, but another to hear it on the airwaves. "I was totally stunned, but I recognized him immediately. Everybody in the family was just ecstatic. It was the most exciting thing that had happened to me. Neither of them had any idea of the magnitude of it all. It was almost disbelief that the disc jockeys would even play it, Dixie said, even though Elvis was thrilled to be playing the Bon Air Club as an extra added attraction with Doug Poindexter and the Starlight Wranglers. He was still just totally innocent and spontaneous, in Dixie's view. There wasn't a conceited bone in his body. In fact, he was still interested in doing the old things, like going to the Humes football games. One night, Charlie Fisher, who remembered him from ROTC, watched him come and sit in front of him at Crump Stadium, named for the congressman and former demagogue mayor E.H. Crump. Elvis was decked out that night, wearing a lavender Ike jacket and matching lavender pants. My wife, Steve, took one look at him and said, "My God, who is that?" I told her, "I think that's Elvis Presley. He's supposed to be making records these days." The whole town was talking about him, but few had actually seen him, and there was some confusion about what race Elvis was, as Dixie soon discovered. Her mother worked with a couple of young black girls who mentioned how much they loved "That's All Right, Mama." Mrs. Locke spoke up and cheerfully said, "My daughter dates him." The girls blinked, incredulous that Mrs. Locke's daughter dated a Negro. She set them straight, told them he was white, but they couldn't believe it, says Dixie, because the type of music that he was singing was typically related to a black musician. Memphis would see for itself on July 30th, 1954, when Elvis played the Overton Park Shell, an outdoor stage in the city's leafy park of the same name. 4 days before, Sam Phillips, who had just formally signed Elvis to Sun Records, had gone to Bob Neal, the WMPS disc jockey whose noonday show Elvis and Dixie frequently attended. Neal, who also ran a little record shop with his wife, Helen, sometimes promoted country concerts. Now he was bringing in a Hillbilly Hoedown, a package show starring Slim Whitman and Billy Walker from the Louisiana Hayride, the live radio show broadcast from Shreveport over KWKH. Since his own show was all requests, Neal was playing Elvis's 2 songs. "Why don't you put him on the bill?" Sam said. Bob, knowing that Sun was a non-union label, asked if he'd been cleared with the musicians' union. "No, but I'll get him in the union." I said fine, Bob recalled 2 decades later. "Let's put him on." It was his first big appearance in a commercial performance. But Sam hadn't gotten him in the union, and when Elvis arrived at the park, the president of the local Federation of Musicians refused to admit him to the stage area. Sam quickly scrambled for the money to make Elvis a member, and then the boy mounted the stage. Elvis went on before Slim Whitman, a big favorite at the time. He launched into "That's All Right, Mama," and whether from nerves or imitation of his hero, Big Chief Wetherington of the Statesman, he suddenly began to shake, his legs a blur of rhythm and romance. Something like electricity zigged through the audience, and Neal was astounded at what he saw. When Elvis came on, he automatically started with a wiggle and a shake. The audience was just screaming and shouting. There was no hype. They were simply reacting to what was on the stage before them. It was almost unbelievable. Of course, this was his hometown, Neal realized. But still, he made a big hit right there. He stole the show right from the first. When Slim Whitman came on, the audience nearly turned him away. "Bring back Elvis! Bring back Elvis!" Among the enthusiasts was Marion Keisker. I'm a very restrained person, and I heard all this female shrieking. One voice just completely stood out. Suddenly, to my chagrin and horror, I realized it was me. Here I am, mother of a young son, on my feet, screaming and whooping like I'd totally lost my stupid mind. I was just transported, But the whole audience was exactly that. He just had that magical, once-in-a-lifetime quality. Dixie was wild with pride that night, but the extreme reactions of the women shocked and angered her. I was like, good grief, I couldn't believe it, because I wanted to say, hey, he's already taken, so y'all just back away. From then on, Dixie was afraid of how Elvis's new fame would affect their relationship, especially after they married. Elvis told her not to worry. He was just playing the little clubs around town, the Bon Air, and soon, once Scotty and Bill split off from the Starlight Wranglers, the Eagle's Nest. But Dixie still fretted. I said, I want him to sing, and I want him to be successful, but I want him to go to work at 9 o'clock and come home at 5. I don't want him to be out all hours of the night in all these clubs. Looking back, she sees that was the dividing line. After his records got so popular, life was never the same for us. 5. You need to be kissed. Dixie was too young to go into some of the little bars and clubs Elvis was playing around town, but he continued to spend all his free time with her, taking her wherever he could, to a radio appearance over in West Memphis, Arkansas, and to his performance at the Katz's drugstore opening, where he sang for a huge crowd of teenagers from the back of a flatbed truck. His high school chum, George Klein, by now a gopher for Dewey Phillips, emceed the event. On September 11th, 1954, 2 days after the Katz opening, Elvis was back in the studio, laying down covers of Dean Martin's I Don't Care If the Sun Don't Shine, and on the flip side of the dial, bluesman Roy Brown's Good Rockin' Tonight. Marion remembered he never came to a session ready, and when he started I Don't Care If the Sun Don't Shine, he knew only one verse and the chorus, which wasn't enough for a record. Sam was eager to get something down, though, because the disc jockey convention was about to take place in Nashville, and he wanted to be able to promote Elvis's second single. So during a break, Marion sat down and wrote some additional lyrics. I don't care if it's rain or snow, driving's cozy when the lights are low. When the record came out, Marion got a call from the music publisher saying he'd noticed Elvis's version contained an added verse. Marion said yes, she'd written it, and told him why. It's the middle of the night, and we've got to get a record out. That was fine, he told her, but she couldn't put her name on it or collect any royalties as a writer. Every time I turned on the radio, I heard someone singing my lyrics, and I was so mad and upset. I wouldn't care if we had gotten some benefit, but that was just indicative of the way the sessions went. If we needed more hamburgers, somebody went out and got them. If we needed more lyrics, somebody wrote them. With what we lacked in money and resources, we had to be inventive. But I think that's what made the music so exciting and creative. Sometimes Dixie would go with Elvis to the recording studio, Elvis often dirty and grimy from work at Crown Electric, and Marion found her to be a very dear girl, quiet and religious, and his #1 booster. Marion was struck by how much in love Elvis and Dixie were, and how genuine their feelings were for each other. Elvis would talk about her and quite often show Marion her picture, which he'd tucked inside his gold wristwatch. After Elvis's first record came out, Bob Neal staged a contest asking young ladies to write in to say, I would like to be the president of Elvis's fan club because, in 25 words or less. I kept Dixie's letter for years, because it was the most glowing and loving tribute. It meant so much to her for Elvis to succeed and be accepted. But when he started spending so much time away from home, it was inevitable something would change in their relationship. It was during this time, the fall of 1954, that Elvis first played outside of Memphis, in a high school gym in Bethel Springs, Tennessee, not far from Jackson. In the audience was musician Carl Perkins, who was amazed at the electric effect Elvis had on his audience, particularly the girls. Bob Neal was booking the trio now, at some point calling Scotty and Bill the Blue Moon Boys and Elvis the Hillbilly Cat. His early morning radio show just boomed right down the Delta, Scotty recalled, so they started working a lot of schoolhouse shows down through that area, traveling 150 to 200 miles around Memphis in Arkansas and Mississippi. Scotty was Elvis's de facto manager, but Bob would help out and officially assume managerial duties in early 1955. He'd tried to get Elvis engagements, help promote him, start the fan club, the stationery was pink and black, advise him on business dealings, and promote his records. It wasn't always an easy thing to do. I had problems trying to get his records played. I knew a lot of people in the business, but the country DJs would say, "We can't play that, he sounds too much like a nigger." I tried it the other way, sent them to rhythm and blues stations. They said, "No, he sounds like a damn hillbilly." Bob had never managed an artist before, and it was pretty much a mom-and-pop operation. Helen went along to the shows many times to sell tickets. Because he had a 5 a.m. sign-on time at the radio station, Bob would get in the back seat and go to sleep on the way home. Elvis would drive, and he and Helen would talk. She was amazed that he was always seeking reassurance and expressing his ambition to become a big movie star. "Do you think I can make it?" he'd ask. "I've got to make it." As Bob recalled, it seemed to be more about Gladys than his own desire to be big. He wanted to be able to provide things for his mother, to buy her a nice home and keep her from having to work, because he adored her more than anything. Pretty soon, Elvis was just like one of our kids, popping in their house any time he wanted and buddying with the Nealses' oldest child, Sonny, who went on the shows and taught Elvis to water ski on the weekends. When Elvis started along, I would MC the show and tell jokes and do my act with my little ukulele. Then I'd bring on the headliner. It's rather amusing, but in a lot of towns, Elvis was not the big draw. I was. Uncle Bob was the hero, and people would gather around to talk to me afterward. They regarded Elvis as sort of a strange new creation. Instead of the record building him, he built the record when he made an appearance. Often when Elvis first came on stage and started performing, audiences didn't know how to react. They were in shock, as Scotty put it. Bill, the clown of the group, would try anything to get the crowd loosened up. Ride the bass or get a pair of bloomers and put them on. If we really had to attribute concert success to anyone in the very early days, it would have to be to Bill. Elvis ran into such a wall on his next big appearance. His one shot on WSM's revered country radio broadcast, the Grand Ole Opry. Sam had set it up with Opry manager Jim Denny, based on Elvis's good showing on the regional Billboard charts. And on October 2nd, 1954, Elvis, Scotty, and Bill drove over to Nashville and appeared on Hank Snow's portion of the program. Backstage, Elvis wandered around, shaking his head at the run-down condition of the Ryman Auditorium, expecting something much nicer. Is this what I've looked forward to all my life? Marion had high hopes for her protégé's appearance and slipped over to Nashville on her own to see him. She sat in the audience for a while, and a woman in front of her asked who she'd come to see. "Elvis Presley," Marion said. "Who?" After the show, Marion replied, "You won't ask me again." Just before Elvis went on, Hank Snow walked up to him. "Well, kid, you ready?" "Yes, sir," Elvis said. The diminutive star looked down at his paper and asked, "What was your name again?" "Elvis. Elvis Presley." "No, what's the name you used on your record?" "Elvis Presley." Snow went out and introduced him as a bright, new, exciting star, but in Scotty's view, it was earth-shattering for all involved. They wouldn't let us do but one song, and we had to do Blue Moon of Kentucky because it was a country song. The audience reaction was very light, and in total, it was a bomb. Elvis was so upset he left his stage costume in a gas station bathroom and cried all the way back to Memphis. He had a better shot 2 weeks later at the Louisiana Hayride, the Opry's upstart cousin, broadcast out of Shreveport's Municipal Auditorium over KWKH, another powerful 50,000-watt station that beamed its signal across the wide expanse of the South. Known as the Cradle of the Stars, the Hayride had launched the careers of Hank Williams, Webb Pierce, Slim Whitman, and Farron Young, boosting Williams, in fact, near the end of his life when the Opry shut him out. Sam had again negotiated the tryout, but Elvis had an ally there already in booker, manager, musician Tillman Franks, who brought Elvis's first single to the attention of Horace Logan, the Hayride's producer. Tillman set up a phone call with Sam and Elvis. "Mr. Franks, I understand that you might get me on the Louisiana Hayride?" And they settled on a fee of $125. Sam made the 17-hour drive to Shreveport with Elvis, Scotty, and Bill, and Elvis was so nervous he could hardly sit still, twitching, drumming, shaking his foot. Their car broke down on the way in, which didn't help matters, and none of them had any money. Elvis was scheduled to appear after Hayride star Ginny Wright, whose duet with Jim Reeves, I Love You, spent 22 weeks on the Billboard country charts. The attractive blonde was sitting on a stool in the wings watching Johnny Horton's performance when Elvis first walked by, a pacing blur in his pink shirt and black pants. She called him over and welcomed him to the Hayride. "Ginny," he said, biting his fingernails, "how in the world can you be so calm?" She felt sorry for the kid, and he brought out her maternal instincts, even though they were about the same age. "Well," she told him, "you take a deep breath, and if you love it, you just go out there and sing." He gave out a little laugh and then asked her if she'd like one of his new promotional pictures. It was dull and cheap-looking, not glossy like the real stars had, but he was proud of it, and signed it to Ginny, Love Elvis. She put it in her guitar case so she wouldn't bruise his ego. Finally, after Ginny's demure rendition of Tell Me How to Get Married, announcer Frank Page brought him on, building him as an artist whose record has skyrocketed up the charts. But the Hayride audience, an older, married crowd who needed a place to go on Saturday night, couldn't get past his outfit. With Scotty and Bill anchoring him on either side, and house drummer DJ Fontana holding down the backbeat behind the curtain, Elvis stuttered when he talked, rocked forward on his feet, and looked like he was about to leap right out into the audience, as Page recalls. He shook his leg a little, more out of nerves than anything, and showed restraint. He seemed at times pinned in, like he was struggling to contain this enormous kinetic force. Before he knew it, he'd moved through both That's All Right, Mama and Blue Moon of Kentucky, the audience connecting more with the latter tune, already knowing it from the father of bluegrass. And then he was off stage, staff fiddler Dober Johnson and his splinter-bustin' hoedown, Black Mountain Rag, in his place. Ginny Wright had been watching from the wings. I thought he was going to get booed off the stage, because he didn't even hardly get any applause at all, and he was real worried. They didn't ask him to come back out or anything. He saw the look on her face. "Ginny," he said, "is there any place we could go get some coffee?" "Yeah, we got a little restaurant down here. You've got to go down the back steps of the building." They were on their way when Tillman Franks stopped him and took him by the arm, seeing how nervous he was. He really didn't get much of a hand, and I know he and Scotty and Bill talked it over. But I told him, don't worry about what you're doing. They ain't hired you yet. You do anything you want. Just relax and get with it. Down in the restaurant, Ginny bought him a hamburger and a cup of coffee. He was awful humble and sweet, she thought, and he talked about his mother. He said, "Ginny, do you miss your mama and daddy?" Because my mother and father were still in Georgia, running a grocery store. And I said, "Yeah, I really do. I tried to call them once or twice a week." Then he fidgeted with the spoon, shaking his foot all the while. "Ginny, I didn't get no applause like you got," he said, his voice downcast. "Well, Elvis, the Louisiana Hayride is a country show. Why don't you get out there sometime and do a country song?" He said, "Well, I can do that. I can sing Old Shep." And he sang for me there at the table, starting off in whisper, "When I was a lad and Old Shep was a pup." Elvis didn't realize it, but the audience that had given him such a light hand at first wanted more. The acts they'd come to know as family now seemed distant and boring, Frank Page wrote. Slowly, they built their enthusiasm for the young trio from Memphis, and when Elvis, Scotty, and Bill were called back out later in the show, the reception was very different. Taking the stage for the second time, Bill primed the audience, jumping around, being silly, and egging Elvis on to move, to shake that leg and loosen up. The crowd seemed younger now, but whether that was true, as Scotty remembers, they reacted. They reacted. On the second appearance, when Elvis started doing that, the roof come in, said Tillman Franks. They just went completely wild. After the show, Sam, Elvis, Horace Logan, and Pappy Covington, the Hayride's booking agent, went in a room and started talking. When they walked out, Elvis had a 12-month contract as a member of the Hayride cast. From the beginning of his 16-month stint there, Elvis was a favorite of the women stars, though nearly each of them had a different relationship with him, from maternal to sisterly to romantic. Almost all of them found him strangely immature, if fun. Vocalist Jeanette Hicks, like so many women, noticed those eyes. He liked to play peekaboo. He used to sneak up behind me backstage, cover my eyes, and say, "Guess who?" in a funny voice. Well, there was no mistaking who it was. But Betty Amos, a singer-comedian, found him harder to take. He was always breaking strings on stage and would run up to her and say, "Betty, quick, can I borrow your guitar?" One night he returned it, absolutely thrashed to death. Just the whole front busted out. And he didn't do anything about it. I was very fond of Elvis, but sometimes I didn't like him very much. He could be sweet, gentle, kind, and thoughtful, but perplexing and aggravating too. He was sexy, handsome, childish, and at times downright cruel. He'd hit me and I'd hit him. Looking back, I suppose in all probability I was the closest he ever came to having a sister. It started with the opposite approach, with flirtation. The first night he was at the Hayride, Amos was backstage coming up the back steps, when Elvis was standing on the landing. I was dressed up, and I had a really good figure. Big boobies, little teeny waist, and I had my makeup and high heels on, and I guess I sashayed a little. And when we got face to face, he said, "You're a little doll." I said, "No, I'm not. I'm a big doll." And I just went on, and I could feel his eyes boring into me as I continued up the steps. Not long after, she was in her dressing room when he walked in, gave her a lethal Rudolph Valentino stare, and announced, "You need to be kissed." He was totally serious, but it caught her so off guard she didn't know whether to say hop to it or to double up her fist and hit him. He came over and gave me his best shot, but it just wasn't there. We looked at each other and I thought, ick, this ain't gonna work. It was like kissing your brother. We both knew right then that we were better suited for something else. And that's when we started laughing and carrying on with each other. The humorous beginning set the pace for their whole relationship, one based on affectionate teasing, though their childish pushing and shoving sometimes turned bizarre, as when they visited a small-town radio station. While the DJ was interviewing another act, Elvis and Betty went out on the lawn, where their usual banter and smacking, we more or less sparred with each other, turned into a wrestling match. I was as strong as he was, and we were actually rolling over and over on the grass. I said, "Will you quit? If somebody sees us out here, this is not going to look good." We were laughing so hard we couldn't really wrestle. But we just did all kinds of silly things like brothers and sisters do. Yet Elvis was also establishing another pattern, that of compartmentalization. At home, he was the church-going and devoted boyfriend of Dixie Locke and the obedient son of Gladys and Vernon. But at the hayride, and soon on its package shows on the road, where he traveled as part of a troupe with Maxine and Jim Ed Brown and other stars, he was Elvis Presley, the charming, charismatic performer and girl teaser supreme. Sometimes 3 generations of women, a grandmother, her daughter, and granddaughter, sat in the front row with the same look of anticipation and awakening on their faces. The bolder ones in the crowd pawed him off stage like hungry animals, sending a clear message that they were only too eager to receive his kisses and more. The boy, who so many girls rebuffed in his youth, was flattered beyond belief. He loved the attention, but he also loved the company of women, and when they surrounded him, asking for autographs or hugs, he was courteous enough to give them at least a minute of his time, no matter what hour of the day or night. There were times, though, when he seemed to exude such an exotic vibe that people seemed either afraid to approach him or were too in awe to do so. Jim Ed Brown remembers such a date in Gilmer, Texas, before Elvis started incorporating his wilder gyrations or began drawing a lot of people on the road. After the show, as the boys were breaking down the equipment, there was a piano over in one of the corners. Elvis went over and sat at it. He could play only a little bit, but he played and sang a few things, and the first thing I knew, people started to go over. But they didn't get close. They stood back about 10 or 15 feet because they didn't know whether to get close or not. Dixie and Gladys came to a number of the hayride performances and road shows within a 150-mile radius of Memphis, and in Dixie's view, both of them were so amazed that the people who came to the concerts were as mesmerized and excited as we had been. But Dixie also saw she was losing her grip on him. Ever since his show at the Overton Park Shell, I felt I was not a part of what he was doing. He was doing something so totally him, and he loved it. Elvis would call his mother every night, no matter where he was. Sometimes, when he was on the road, Dixie would stay with her, sleeping in Elvis's bed at the Presley's new rental house at 2414 Lamar Avenue. Elvis encouraged the sleepovers. He wanted his parents to keep an eye on her to make sure Dixie wasn't seeing other boys. But he telephoned her at home less and less, particularly as more women became available to him. Before long, girls were swarming around him by the hundreds, as Horace Logan remembered, making him forget his homesickness for Dixie, and also making him push the limit on the Assembly of God's tenets about premarital sex. His mother taught him all his life that a godly person honored himself and his body. But did that go for hayride stars, too? After 19 years of never being far from his mama's apron strings, he was finally on his own, Logan noted, and he relished the freedom. In Shreveport, where he could be a whole new person, the conventional rules of romance and commitment didn't seem so rigid. Not when he was living a life in which the established stars accepted him as a peer, and especially since he was about to dethrone the hayride's Tibby Edwards as the heartthrob, the little dude, the one who made the women swoon. There were so many girls eager to teach him about sex, about life, about himself. It all fed his ego with a big spoon, especially as he had arrived there as an unknown, very much sheltered and unschooled about sexual intimacy. Everything did a 180-degree turn, his cousin Billy Smith says, when Elvis realized the effect he had on women. In a sense, Elvis grew up on the hayride, But his experiences with his female fans left him damaged in his social interaction with women. By the end of his hayride period, all boundaries would disappear. After a certain point, he wouldn't even have to bother to politely court. He was Elvis. Like many of the stars, Elvis stayed at the low-rent All-Ida Motel in Bossier City when he played the hayride, and he usually shared a room with Scotty and Bill. From his second appearance, long lines of teenage girls, 1950s groupies, formed outside their room each Saturday night after the show. Some just wanted to see him up close, but others wanted more intimate contact. Sometimes he had 3 or 4 girls in his room at once, though he later told his father it was 6, laughing that 14 or 16 will get you 20, meaning having sex with 14 or 16-year-olds would get you 20 years in jail. As long as the girl had nice legs, a decent face, and a shapely derriere, he was interested. Breasts were secondary, suggesting a touch of androgyny in his libido. I sometimes drove by the motel myself before I went home and personally saw as many as 300 girls there, Horace Logan wrote. Elvis scored whenever he wanted. He screwed around with so many girls he'd never seen before and never saw again that I'm surprised he didn't catch something and die. Maxine Brown was also amazed. Everybody knew that the guys screwed everything in sight. Girls were throwing themselves onto Elvis all of the time. Who's going to resist that? And if Elvis didn't want them, Scotty or Bill or Jim Ed did. The women had to push themselves on Scotty, who was married. Elvis wasn't always having full-out sex, though, and in fact, he was more interested in titillation than penetration. He was 19 years old, almost a man, but still a boy emotionally. Sometimes he was content with a pillow fight, because he feared getting a girl pregnant, and so he could technically stay true to Dixie. He held to dry humping as long as he could, both he and the girl keeping their clothes on, but getting the rush all the same. When things progressed beyond that point, he usually stuck to intense foreplay, sometimes asking a girl to masturbate him, and then ejaculating in her hair. If his partner found it degrading, a complete act of submission and dominance, it also made sense. Her head was the farthest point from potential pregnancy. Elvis's first experience of real intercourse, which came at either age 19 or 20, was both traumatic and uninformed. He had met the girl only that day, and before long he was in the hotel lobby, searching for Scotty and Bill, his face a tangle of confusion. "The rubber busted," he said. "What do I do now?" Bill chuckled. "I think you had better marry her, or get the hell out of town." That left him on his own to solve the crisis, and the next time they saw him, they asked what he had done. "I took her to the emergency room at the hospital." "The emergency room?" "Yeah, I got them to give her a douche." Soon he vowed to never break a virgin and to fool around only with experienced girls. In truth, he liked everything that led up to intercourse better than the act itself. The kissing, the stroking, the darting of fingers, the removal of the blouse. He preferred that a girl keep her panties on, though it drove him wild to see the slightest bit of pubic hair poking around the seams of her underwear. But he respected women, and it was always important that the girl receive more pleasure than he. Elvis wasn't the only male star on the hayride running wild, of course, but Maxine Brown never thought about him being sexy. Like Betty Amos, she regarded Elvis as a brother. She was 4 years older, and she couldn't believe the way girls hounded him everywhere he went, backstage, at the motel, and on the road once they started touring together. Though the girls were crazy about him, many of the mamas didn't want their daughters hanging out and going to the shows because of the way he wiggled, Maxine remembers. They thought it was vulgar, but I didn't. I thought it was great. Never thought of anything like that at all. Elvis still hadn't really broken in the national press, but around the region, and even in Memphis, there was talk that what he was doing was unholy, that he was performing the devil's music. Elvis was stung by it. It made him burn right through his skin, and Marian had to console him. I remember very strongly people praying for him in the churches, and I knew what a deeply religious person he was. So I was talking to him one day, and something was said about how they felt about him, and his eyes filled up. He said, "Well, Marian, the only thing I can say is they don't know me." Then he laughed and said, "But it don't hurt to have a few people praying for you." On the other hand, Elvis was soon making more money than he or his parents had ever seen in their lives. It was modest by most entertainment standards. He got only scale for the hayride broadcasts, and he split his take with Scotty and Bill on the road. But he couldn't believe his good fortune, and in his role reversal, it thrilled him to provide for his parents, whom he saw as his dependents. In late 1954, he wired his parents funds from Houston. "Hi, babies. Here's the money to pay the bills. Don't tell no one how much I sent. I will send more next week. There is a card in the mail. Love, Elvis." On December 8, 1954, he went back into the Sun's studio with Scotty and Bill, recording the hillbilly blues of "You're a Heartbreaker" and "Milk Cow Blues Boogie." He had the confidence now to loosen up and let things roll. "Hold it, fellas. That don't move me. Let's get real gone for a change." There was a different crackle in the air, Marian noticed. Sometimes Elvis would get so tickled by Bill's antics in the studio that he would roll on the floor and kick his heels and laugh. By early 1955, no act could follow him on stage, and shortly he would be headlining. "When we started working with Elvis," says Maxine, "we got top billing over him, but that didn't last long." Once that happened, both Elvis and his fans threw all caution to the wind. On a tour through Texas booked by DJ Tom Perryman, who also managed the Browns, Elvis and Jim Ed's fellow performers speculated that J.E. and Elvis must be betting on how many girls they could score with in a single night. As Maxine noted, "Some of us eavesdropped and counted them. Tom came by, saw what was going on, shook his head and said, 'By God, those boys are going to wear those things out if they don't slow down.' Often on the road, girls would sit in the front row where the stage lights fell and lift their skirts to expose their naked parts. Gladys was there in Arkansas one night when girls stormed the stage and threw their panties at him, and Elvis had to pay for it. Gladys was appalled that young teens would do this to her son, and Elvis was embarrassed because they did it in front of his mother. I'm not sure that she handled that real well, Dixie says of Gladys's emotional reaction to Elvis's becoming a sex star. Of course, she wanted him to be loved and to achieve the fame and the notoriety that he wanted. But at the same time, there was a side of her that wanted to think that her son was still remaining pure and innocent through the whole thing. Kind of a two-sided coin there. Gladys always asked Maxine to take good care of Elvis, and Maxine tried her best, paying for his dry cleaning and doing his washing, though he went shy on her when she asked for his undershorts. He didn't have but a couple of pairs, and he purposely didn't wear any when he performed. The rumor circulated that he wore a toilet paper roll or a sock in his pants to make himself look bigger, but it wasn't true. Sometimes Elvis, who was uncircumcised, got aroused, particularly when his pants rubbed him just so. One night, when Elvis's parents came to the hayride, he walked off stage after, taking a number of encores, and just about brought the house down. Gladys grabbed him up by the arm and pulled him over to the side of the stage where no one could hear them. "Elvis," she said sternly, "don't you have any drawers?" He thought fast and said, "No, ma'am. The only pair I own was dirty, and Maxine wouldn't wash 'em." "Honey, God, he was huge," Maxine says, "and it showed. And then when he'd shake his leg, my God, you could tell he had a heart-on. It looked like it. Hell, he knew what he was doing. Bill Black went out and said, "I'm going to buy Elvis some shorts." And he thought, I'll play a trick on him. He bought him some silk ones, polka dots. He thought Elvis wouldn't wear them, but Elvis fell in love with them and wouldn't even take 'em off. He didn't want me to wash them. He was afraid somebody would steal them. I guarantee you he wore silk underwear for the rest of his life when he wore any at all. He loved them. Betty Amos also looked out for Elvis, dispensing advice and offering to iron his shirts. I said to him one time, "Give me your shirt and I'll take it over to my room and iron it." He said, "That's all right." I said, "My God, you're a sex symbol. You're going out on stage with a wrinkled shirt? Give me that thing." In the mornings, after the road shows, she'd see Elvis in the restaurant having breakfast, and he was never alone. He'd have some little old girl over there, his latest. I think a lot of times he didn't care about any of these women he was with. It was just for show. When you're with a different one every day, there's nothing there. But he'd look over at me, and I'd look over at him, and I'd raise my eyebrows or shake my head like, "That's good," or "That's bad," like a sister is supposed to do. They all looked pretty much the same to me. There was no raving beauties, and there were no ugly girls. Nobody who really stood out. Gladys, frightened by the changes in her son, wanted him to stay at home and be a gospel singer, Maxine remembers. She was afraid for him to be out in the world the way he was. But she also thought Betty was the perfect girl for Elvis to pal around with, because I talked about Jesus and God all the time, and Elvis was completely fascinated by that and wanted me to talk more about it. I think he wanted to believe really bad. Betty was a good influence on Elvis, but he was far more interested in Maxine and Jim Ed's comely sister. 17-year-old Bonnie Brown was a sweet, quiet girl with fair skin, raven hair, and an ample bosom. She, too, was soon performing on the hayride. The first night, Maxine and Jim Ed introduced her as our little sister Bonnie. But as Maxine wrote in Looking Back to See, a country music memoir, when she walked out on that stage, dressed in her tight-fitting outfit, we thought the guys in the audience were going to tear the place down. In the beginning, Elvis and Bonnie didn't seem interested in each other. But then one day in West Texas, she was relaxing around the motel pool, killing time before a show. Bonnie had her hair in curlers, and Elvis, still so immature he went around handcuffing people to him, came along and pushed her in the pool. She was livid, but after he dived in after her, she joined in the fun, and they were soon together all the time. He was crazy about her, and she was about him too, Maxine says. Bonnie had never been in love before, and it was serious. She was staying out late with Elvis, and one night she woke Maxine up to tell her that he had proposed. They wanted to get married, she told her, but they'd both decided to put it off for a while since they were so young. The Brown family owned a restaurant and supper club in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, called the Trio Club, where Elvis would sometimes rehearse. Now that he was interested in Bonnie, he made a point to stop by more frequently, especially on his way to the hayride. All the Browns, including Bonnie's parents, Floyd and Bertie, came to regard him as family. Mrs. Brown cooked for him, and he couldn't get enough of her banana pudding, Maxine says. He loved her because she looked kind of like Gladys, and so she took him under her wing. A lot of times, coming back from the shows, he spent the night with the Browns instead of going on to Memphis. Their baby sister Norma would give up her bed, which was situated in Floyd and Bertie's bedroom. The intimacy didn't bother Elvis. In fact, he found it comforting, as it precisely duplicated the sleeping arrangement he'd had with Vernon and Gladys as a child in Tupelo. Maxine knew he didn't sleep much, and noticed his nervous leg, and how he'd get his toes stuck in the holes of the Browns' bedsheets. Before morning, they would be torn into shreds, but Mother didn't care. She loved him, and it gave her an excuse to go buy some new ones. Apart from his pursuit of Bonnie and his professional association with Maxine and Jim Ed, Elvis seemed to relish a stable and secure family atmosphere. He taught little Norma how to play the piano, and a lot of times, when Maxine, Jim Ed, and Bonnie were on the road, he would come and play baseball in the backyard with her after a helping of Bertie's home cooking. On the road, Jim Ed remembered, he would eat a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If he ate 3 times a day, that is. But that's all he ever ate. His mother was evidently a good cook, and he just waited until he got back home to his mama. According to Maxine, Elvis's love affair with Bonnie ended as quickly as it began. One night, she went out to dinner, and he was in this booth, all loved up with this other girl. He didn't know Bonnie was there, and she said, "That's the end of that." In time, Elvis could be cavalier when relationships ended, but he seemed to romanticize any girl who showed him the door. 3 years later, before Elvis went into the Army, Vernon would tell Maxine that Elvis was still in love with Bonnie and wanted her to wait for him to return from the service. But though Bonnie pined for him, she wouldn't be burned twice. Elvis Presley was a highly sexed young guy, remembered Bill Randall, a top disc jockey in Cleveland, Ohio, who first met Elvis in February 1955 and worked with him several times in the next 2 years. He was a randy rooster, actually, in that kind of colloquial terminology, and he was very active sexually. All these very well-developed young women and excited groupies would congregate around backstage, and Elvis Presley's car was used not only to sell the records out of the trunk between the intermissions, but also it was a sexual assignation place. There was a lot of activity in that car. At the hayride, Elvis wasted no time on a broken heart, and, in fact, from the beginning, he'd set his sights on another girl, an energetic, doe-eyed beauty named Carolyn Bradshaw. With dark hair and eyes, she resembled a glorified Gladys, though she was far smaller, standing only 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighing 95 pounds. She took a lot of ribbing about being a shorty. Betty Amos was 5'7", and when she held her arm out, Carolyn could stand under it. Cute little thing, as Betty terms her. Now, I was a big doll, but Carolyn was a little doll, and Elvis wanted to meet her. One of the first questions Elvis asked me when I met him was, "Is Carolyn Bradshaw going to be on the show tonight?" Horace Logan remembered. And he had another question. "Is she as good-looking in person as she is in her pictures?" When he saw her in person, Logan wrote in his book, Elvis, Hank, and Me, Making Musical History on the Louisiana Hayride, I think he was even more taken by her. Carolyn Bradshaw would epitomize 3 romantic ideals in Elvis's heart, fueling his obsession with virgins, beauty queens, and tiny brunettes with China doll faces. Physically, she was, in fact, the prototype, the first Priscilla. She was born in Arkansas as the youngest of 11 children of a cotton farmer who died when she was 7. After the 8th grade, she and her mother, Eugenia, moved to Shreveport, where Carolyn's older sister, Jo, was already working. The 3 shared a small apartment, and on Saturday nights, Carolyn started attending the hayride. Jo, also a beauty, dated Johnny Horton. Though she studied acting and dance, Carolyn's real ambition was to be a famous singer. After she belted out Hank Williams's Jambalaya on stage with Jim Reeves at the Rio Palm Isle Club in Longview, Texas, the vivacious 15-year-old was hooked on both the applause and the attention. When you come from a family of 11, well, I don't think they knew I was there until I was 5 years old. Her manager, Faber Robinson, who ran his clients' careers with a steel hand, signed her to his own Abbott label, recording her one top 10 hit, The Marriage of Mexican Joe, an answer song to Reeves's Mexican Joe in 1953. That same year, at age 16, she joined the Hayride cast and went on to win the 1954 Louisiana state title of Petite Miss Physical Culture. Her hit song, coupled with her good looks, promised a bright future. She did a tour of California with Reeves, trading her white-fringed cowgirl outfits for cocktail dresses and high heels, and landed a 3-month stint on Cliffy Stone's radio and television shows as a fill-in for pregnant girl singer Bucky Tibbs. She was still on Stone's hometown jamboree when Elvis first came to the Hayride. When I left that show and came back to Shreveport, nobody knew I was coming, so I just went backstage to visit with all of the group. The girls were telling me about this new guy on the show, Elvis Presley, who'd been there 2 or 3 times by then. They were going on and on about him, and I was thinking, who is this upstart? And somebody said, well, you just wait and see. And then the following Saturday night, there he was. And I saw. Oh boy, did I see. He was magnetic, just awesome even then. Carolyn was only an average talent. She relied on a strong regional twang and a fiery delivery to carry a song. But she tried hard and had a lot of guts, and I had such fun doing it on stage that I don't think people cared whether I could sing or not. Her fresh-faced appeal made her popular with the boys, who greeted her with wolf whistles and queued up for her autograph. Some of the female cast members were jealous of her, particularly since she'd been dating Tibby Edwards. He was little, sweet, and cute, and all the girls went gaga over him, says Nita Lynn, a girl her age and Carolyn's best friend on the show. Carolyn knew how high-tempered women could be, so she didn't let it bother her. But even that hadn't prepared her for the female reaction to Elvis. We had our fans at personal appearances and at the Hayride, but they didn't just absolutely lose their mind over any of us, and they did over Elvis. I think I was more in a state of mild shock than anything else. I've never seen anybody, man or woman, with that kind of magnetism. The first time they spoke, he looked down at me with this little half grin and those sleepy eyes, and I just loved it. He had a nervous way of standing, but he was easy to talk to, and he laughed a lot, and I thought, wow, I see what the ladies are talking about. He was just my type, really sexy. There's just no other word for it. He kept company with her from that first night when a group of the Hayride cast, Ginny Wright, the Rowley Trio, and his rival-to-be, Tibby Edwards, went over to Bossier City for a bite after the show. In the next few days, he'd start taking her to all the usual hangouts. Muriel Stanzel's Bantam Grill, where he played the pinball machine, and where steel guitar great Jimmy Day teased Elvis about how much Carolyn could eat. And Harry's Barbecue, a favorite of George Jones and Farron Young. Of course, they went to the movies. Elvis, or Elle, as she called him, borrowing the Browns' car for a date at the Strand Theater. She really liked him, remembers Shreveport radio personality Louise Alley, who lived across the hall from the Bradshaw family in the apartment house, and bumped into the polite young man, "Excuse me, ma'am," on the stairs as he came to pick her up for a date. Carolyn always found Elvis extremely respectful, though affectionate. He was an ideal date, almost, and the best kisser. The only thing is that he was very, very restless. There was one movie that I really wanted to see, and he kept getting up and going out. He couldn't even sit still. Finally, I gave up and said, "Let's just go, you're not enjoying this." So we left. I've often wondered what created that. I think there was just an emptiness in his life. When he first took her out, Carolyn excitedly called her friend Nita Lynn. "You will never guess who I'm dating. Elvis." Nita was currently on tour with Johnny Horton and Paul Howard and his Arkansas Cotton Pickers, and she hadn't kept up with the news. "Who? Don't tell me you haven't heard of Elvis Presley." "I'm afraid not, but the name is enough to choke a horse. "He's a cat," Carolyn said, meaning he was a cool cat. He played the kind of music that wasn't the 3-chord Hank Williams songs we played, and he moved on stage, as Nita later wrote. Soon, he asked Carolyn to go study. In her view, Elle and I were well matched. We had a lot of interests in common, and shared things, and talked. Nita believes Elvis would have married Carolyn because he was just madly in love with her. You could tell when he was around her. But they didn't have deep conversations, and Carolyn didn't know anything about Dixie Locke or even about his romance with Bonnie Brown. Confusion arose at the end of 1954 when Carolyn, a one-man woman, heard from Pappy Covington that Elvis was not honoring his promise to her. "That was the one time I was really upset. Pappy was like my own father, and he said, 'I don't want you to get your heart broken, so just understand that Elvis is going to be seeing a lot of women.'" "All of his romances were short," says Hayride announcer Frank Page. "Carolyn's name kept coming up as being his girlfriend, and I thought maybe she might be something special to him." But he couldn't seem to change his ways. In fact, once Carolyn's friend Nita got back to Shreveport, Elvis would discreetly try to put his arm around her shoulders, but she'd have none of it. "After a few times, I threw his arm from around me and told him, 'Listen, Elvis, you keep your hands to yourself.' That brought guffaws from the musicians, since most girls encouraged Elvis's affections. But Nita found him cocky, and she didn't like some of his language either, especially when he took the Lord's name in vain. It wouldn't be long before a high school principal in Mobile, Alabama, stopped Elvis's show because he told an off-color joke. Carolyn never confronted Elvis about the others, but she wondered what his parents thought about his sexual behavior. She met Gladys and Vernon only once backstage, and her heart sank when she realized Elvis had never told them about her, that they reacted as if she were just another singer on the hayride. But she saw how Elvis's dynamic attraction for women troubled his mother. She was very quiet and reserved and didn't smile very much. His father smiled a little bit more, but neither of them had much to say. If I had been his mother, I would have been very afraid of where it all was leading. Still, Carolyn forgave him for keeping company with the other girls because she still wanted to see him. She'd have to be sure that he was dedicated and faithful before she completely gave her heart, though. And coming from a family of pretty devout Presbyterians, I had some strong moral values. But she tried to keep a positive attitude. She was an independent girl, and if things didn't work out, they could both go on to greener pastures. She was very sharp and spunky, offers Ginny Wright, and her mother watched her real close. Carolyn was still going to school at that time, so her mother wouldn't let her book too much. She told Faber, "My daughter's too young to be going out on the road and keeping those hours." But Carolyn did go over to East Texas on the package shows sometimes, and at least one photograph, taken at the Hawkins, Texas high school gym in December 1954, attests to their few appearances together. The next day, she was either still on the road or couldn't raise her head off the pillow to go to school. That prompted the truant officer to visit her mother a time or two. I gave that poor lady such grief. But she still insisted on being part of it all. With Bill or Scotty behind the wheel, Elvis and Carolyn would harmonize in the back seat, working up gospel songs like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." Elvis would sing bass, and something about the way he looked when he sang it tickled her, and they'd tumble with laughter. The Memphis Flash, as Horace Logan called Elvis in his hayride introductions, was still green in his stage prattle. "Friends, I'm too poop to pop," replying he was sick, sober, and sorry when Logan asked him how he was getting along. But he was already outgrowing the radio show, and soon Elvis would be too big for its package shows, too. Particularly after Bob Neal's management contract took effect in January 1955, and the records charted higher, and he toured nearly every day of the year. Elvis would let Carolyn know when his shows were close enough for her to attend, and he and Scotty and Bill would swing through and pick her up. That posed a problem. Mom didn't care a lot about my seeing musicians, and a lot of our dates were en route to and from his appearances. Boy, this almost drove her crazy. It all made Carolyn's head spin, too. Everything was happening so fast. Elvis was like a comet streaking across the sky. By March, he was headlining, and by May, he created riots wherever he went. By June, he'd outgrown Neil as his solo manager, and by July, he'd hit the national charts. Come October, he would be too big for the Little Sun label, and that meant he'd be ready for a national launch in 1956. And where would that leave them? I think the potential was there for us to fall in love, but the pull of fame and the reality of how popular he was becoming meant the relationship didn't have a chance to develop. He was getting so busy that I never knew from one time to the other how long it would be until I would see him again. Finally, she concluded that any time might be the last time, and after a few months, the romance flamed out. It wasn't like we broke up or said goodbye. We didn't even get to say goodbye. He was just whisked away and out of my life. And just as Elvis's career was in its stratospheric rise, Carolyn stalled. She was a beautiful young lady, in the view of Tom Bearden of the Hayride's Rhythm Harmoniers. She had some projection and she presented a good entertainer appearance. But she never found the right songs that fit her style, and she was said to rebuff the sexual advances of her manager, who lost interest in the female singers who refused to sleep with him. Without a competent manager, and with her mother limiting her personal appearances on the road, she was never able to advance to the next level. At the time, all I wanted to do was sing, she says. But then, after her professional and personal disappointments, she just wanted out. In late 1955, at the age of 18, she left the show and her recording career and moved to Memphis, working at first for Bob Neal. In recent years, an amateur singer who uses the surname Presley has said that he is one of twin sons of Carolyn Bradshaw and Elvis Presley, but his birth date suggests otherwise, and he has provided no proof of his parentage. Carolyn dismisses his claims in 2 words. He's crazy. According to Shirley Dew, a friend of Priscilla Presley since the 1970s, anybody who's ever claimed that Elvis fathered her child has been tested, and they've all come out negative. Shirley was surprised and told Priscilla so. She laughed and she said, "Can you believe it? I'm just as shocked as you are. You would think there's got to be more children out there. But nope, never, not a one." However, that doesn't mean that there isn't a child who hasn't come forward. Horace Logan wrote in his book that he knew of at least one woman in Houston who had a daughter by Elvis during the Hayride days. Houston was one of the first big cities to embrace Elvis, and he appeared around the area frequently on package shows with other of the Hayride stars during that time. "You're bound to remember me, Mr. Logan," the woman said when she called him 20 years later for help with concert tickets. "Elvis and I were always together when he was playing in Houston in '55. Logan didn't remember the woman, but he didn't doubt her story, and when she told him that her daughter was unaware that Elvis was her father, I thought maybe if she could see him, I might be able to get up my nerve. He advised her to let sleeping dogs lie." "I could hear her crying softly," he wrote, "as I hung up the phone." 6. A giant, big, beautiful hunk of forbidden fruit. On a mild October night in 1954, Bob Neal invited country music promoter Oscar Davis to the Eagle's Nest in Memphis to see his new act. Davis, a short, silver-haired man who dressed to the nines, was in town promoting an Eddie Arnold show at Ellis Auditorium on behalf of Colonel Tom Parker, Eddie's former manager, who still did some of Arnold's booking. Like Parker, Davis was an old carny who'd seen everything. As a vaudeville promoter, he once even toured a girl frozen alive in ice. But the faded impresario hadn't seen anything like Elvis. And he told Neil, "Bob, this guy is incredible. I'd like to meet him." 2 nights later, Bob brought Elvis backstage, where Davis told the young singer how impressed he'd been and that he hoped they could work together. The next day, Davis returned to Nashville and drove straight out to Madison, Tennessee to see the Colonel, who was in the middle of lunch with yet another carny, Charlie Lamb, who'd gone legit as a country music journalist. "It was really Oscar who found Elvis," Lamb says. "He came over and said, 'I saw the darndest act you ever imagined. This kid who does this twisting around and so forth.'" The Colonel's eyes popped open and he said, "Where was he? Who is he?" And the Colonel got up from the table and pulled his car out and left. He still wasn't back when I went out there the next day. DJ Fontana, the staff drummer for the hayride, sometimes went out on the road with Elvis, and he remembers Parker showing up in Texas and Arkansas. We would see him walking around, hanging back in the shadows, but he never would say nothing. A lot of people just didn't want to deal with him. However, Bob Neal, now Elvis's official manager, jumped at the chance. He recognized Parker as a razzle-dazzle character, but knew the Colonel had clout, and that he was an uneducated genius, a brilliant tactician. He also saw that Parker could put Elvis on the package tours that he took out to other parts of the country, into New Mexico, for example, beyond the hayride's reach. On January 15, 1955, Parker and his lieutenant, Tom Diskin, traveled to Shreveport to watch Elvis, outfitted in a rust-colored suit, a black-dotted purple tie, and pink socks, captivate the hayride audience. Afterward, at the Captain Shreve Hotel, they met with Neil and hammered out an arrangement by which Parker would work in partnership with Bob on Elvis's bookings. Already, Parker schemed to take total control of Bob's new sensation. But until Bob's management contract expired the following year, the Colonel was careful not to show his hand, even though it was obvious that Neil didn't know what he had. "I always felt that Elvis was going to be a big artist, but I didn't really realize the true scope. Nobody had ever been that big." On the other hand, Parker, a shrewd dealer with uncanny knowledge of human nature, knew what brought people into the big tent. Born in Holland as Andreas Cornelis van Kuijk, he had entered the United States illegally in 1929, and after a stint in the U.S. Army, folded into the carnivals at the height of the Depression. It was there, between hawking his now infamous foot-long hot dogs, a hint of meat at each end with lots of slaw in the middle, that he honed the merchandising and marketing skills he would later apply to the recording industry. His entree into the music business was Gene Austin, the 1920s crooner, My Blue Heaven, who needed an advance man for his tent show, the Star-O-Rama Theater, in the late 1930s, the last hurrah of his career. Parker segued to booking country shows, particularly Pee Wee King and Roy Acuff, while employed as the field agent for the Hillsborough County, Florida Humane Society in Tampa. Acuff later flirted with the idea of letting Parker manage him, but eventually the bandleader thought better of it and told Parker to keep his eye on King's young vocalist, Eddie Arnold. The two teamed up in 1945. "I was just a poor, hungry guy who owned a guitar," Eddie said, and Parker worked around the clock on his behalf. While continuing to operate out of Tampa, he acted as Arnold's booking agent and manager, using the two-fingered hunt and peck system to type letters on flamboyant stationery festooned with Arnold's photograph. Soon the Colonel, his title was honorary, bestowed by Jimmy Davis, the singing governor of Louisiana in 1948, was prosperous enough to move to a stone house outside of Nashville. Ever the showman, he kept a team of miniature ponies in the backyard. Their association made Arnold one of the biggest stars ever to come out of Nashville, with a repertoire of #1 records, radio shows, and 2 Hollywood movies. But Parker's brash, rough-hewn style clashed with Arnold's sophistication and polish. And in the early 1950s, Arnold learned that Parker, who took a 25% commission for exclusivity, was working with other artists on the side. Both Arnold and Parker had encouraged Texas Fireball Charlene Arthur to come to town. Elvis would pay plenty of attention to her wild stage movements, allegedly borrowing a few, and Arnold wasn't threatened by his interest in developing the teenage Tommy Sands. But when the Colonel began booking dates for Hank Snow, Arnold dissolved the majority of their business dealings in 1953, Parker still getting the best of him with a financial settlement. With his own jamboree attractions, the Colonel began booking Grand Ole Opry stars, placing many of them on New York radio and television shows through his association with the William Morris Agency. He also managed the 1954 RCA Victor Country Caravan, showcasing Chet Atkins, Minnie Pearl, Hawkshaw Hawkins, and the Davis sisters. Headlining was Hank Snow, already a star, but soon to become bigger with the network television appearances that Parker arranged for him. The two made a deal to expand Jamboree Attractions to give Snow part ownership, rechristening the business Hank Snow Enterprises, Jamboree Attractions. All along, however, Parker saw it as a temporary arrangement. He was also looking beyond country music for the next big thing. Someone he could call, in carnival parlance, my attraction. He found him in 1955. When Tom was driving to New York to finalize what he needed to do about Elvis, recalls David Wilds, whose father, Honey Wilds, made up half of the blackface comedy duo Jam Up and Honey, he and his wife, Marie, stopped and spent time with us. I was about 11, and I remember sitting in our living room and hearing Marie tell Mother, "Tom's found this wonderful boy, just the most remarkable thing. Honey, he sings sexy hillbilly." My mother looked kind of bug-eyed, and Daddy thought Tom had lost his mind, being gone over Elvis Presley. He thought it was the biggest mistake Tom ever made. By the time he hooked up with Elvis, Parker could brag that he was one of country music's premier booking agents and advancemen, even as many still saw him as a carny operator out for a quick buck. In addition to Pee Wee King, Roy Acuff, Minnie Pearl, and Jam Up and Honey, at one time or another his stable included Ernest Tubb, Benny Martin, Rod Brasfield, the Duke of Paducah, Clyde Moody, George Morgan, Slim Whitman, and the Carter family. For a short spell, he also managed June Carter on her own. Now he was only too happy to get as many clients as possible on the Hank Snow Enterprises Jamboree Attractions tours. In February 1955, Elvis went back into the recording studio to cut his 4th Sun single, Baby Let's Play House. The Arthur Gunter song, heavy on playful innuendo and full of pent-up sexual energy, would be the first Elvis record ever to chart, climbing to number 10 on the Billboard Country and Western chart, and number 5 on the Country Disc Jockey chart, hanging on for a surprising 15 weeks. On February 6th, 3 days after his recording session, Elvis realized a lifelong dream when he performed 2 shows at Alice Auditorium, where he had taken his fantasy curtain calls only a few years before. He was at the bottom of a bill that included hillbilly star Farron Young and gospel great Martha Carson, but the posters boasted Memphis's own Elvis Presley, and he was proud to make good in his hometown. After the first show, he looked up in the autograph line, and there stood Billy Wardlaw. A flood of emotions came over them both, and they laughed to cover them up. Elvis took one of his new Sun Records promotional pictures and thought a minute, finally writing across it, "To Billy, my little ex." Between shows, Bob Neal arranged a meeting between Sam Phillips and the Colonel across the street at Palumba's restaurant. Parker brought his right-hand man, Tom Diskin, and things started off friendly enough with the four of them as they discussed how to further the career of the act that brought them together. Then the Colonel looked at Phillips and dropped the bomb. The boy could not realize his dreams on a small-time label like Sun. In fact, Parker had already met with RCA Victor, where he'd done business for Eddie Arnold and Hank Snow, to see about purchasing Elvis's contract. When Phillips protested, the Colonel turned a deaf ear. The papers might not be signed yet, but it made no difference whether Phillips wanted to sell Elvis's contract. The Colonel was now in control, and Elvis was changing labels. On February 16, 1955, Elvis played the Odessa Senior High School Fieldhouse in Odessa, Texas, where 18-year-old Roy Orbison could hardly believe what he saw on stage. His energy was incredible. His instinct was just amazing. There was just no reference point in the culture to compare it. 4 days later, Parker sent Elvis out on his second Hank Snow Jamboree tour of the month, billed as a WSM Grand Ole Opry show with the added attractions of the Duke of Paducah and Nashville music legend Mother Maybelle Carter and the Carter sisters, Helen, June, and Anita. They would tour together again for 3 weeks in May, but Anita never got over his fevered gyrations or the crowd's reactions to them. We went out there and watched him, and I said, "My Lord!" The boy had talent, but I couldn't believe the audience. It was not just young girls. There were people with gray hair out there screaming. Every night, the girls would try to tear his clothes off of him. His buttons were always gone, and Mama would take the buttons off of all our clothes and put them on his. So we were always buttonless. Elvis had a huge crush on Anita, who played stand-up bass and sang soprano. Whenever Anita was around, said Red West, Elvis was like a kid with 6 pair of feet. He did anything he could to get her attention. Meanwhile, Elvis's relationship with Dixie was still limping along, and he had promised to take her to her junior prom on May 6th. But he had shows right up until then. The night before, in fact, a pack of girls chased him across a football field in Mobile, Alabama. I was so afraid he was not going to get back in town for my prom, and his mom and I had been shopping, and she had bought my dress. However, Dixie was more fearful that they would never realize their plans for the future. One day he was unknown, and then, just overnight, he was there. It was phenomenal. He showed up at her door, not in the dark blue suit of his own senior prom, but in a handsome white tuxedo jacket, and in Bob and Helen's brand new Lincoln, which he'd borrowed for the evening. They double-dated with Dixie's best friend, Bessie Wolverton, and Elvis's cousin, Gene Smith. It was a storybook evening. He looked like a movie star, and Dixie was proud to show him off to her friends. But she was troubled by the changes in Elvis. She knew in her heart that he had been unfaithful to her, which went against all the teachings of their church. And she didn't like his new friends, especially Red West, and a crowd of guys who had begun to hang around when Elvis was in town. They all smoked and drank and used offensive language, and the surprising thing was that Elvis seemed to want them around. Why did he need them? It used to be that all Elvis and Dixie needed was each other, and they were hardly ever alone anymore. And what kind of future were they going to have if he was running around the country all the time? They argued about it, but they had argued before over his possessiveness. Elvis was always jealous of what she might be doing while he was away, though she had more cause to worry than he did. Yes, she went to Busy Betty on Lamar and danced, but she wasn't dating anyone. Was she just supposed to sit home for 3 weeks while he was away? She wanted to have some fun, too. Friends on both sides had begun to doubt that they would marry, because neither one would accept the other's terms, in the words of Barbara Hearn, who went to school with Dixie at Southside and worked with her at Goldsmith's department store. But each time Dixie gave Elvis back his class ring, Once or twice he even asked for it back. They'd both cry and want to make up. Sometimes he would angrily speed off in his car, and before she could even get back in the house, he was there again, and they'd sit on the porch and hold each other, both in agony over their decision. What were they going to do? It was kind of a mutual thing. His career was going in one direction, and I didn't feel that I could be a part of it. It consumed him, and there wasn't much time for anything else. They kept patching it up, saying they could work it out, but by the end of the summer, they both knew it was over. She had wanted him to stop at the top and go back to a simpler life, but he said, "No, I'm in too deeply." He was already swallowed up by the myth, by something he couldn't control. He felt like there were too many people depending on him, and he couldn't do what he wanted to do. He was told to go here and go there, and these people can come and these can't. I knew that it was not ever going to go into anything. She and Gladys cried about it together, but they would always be friends. They were family almost, and that would never change. Whenever he was back in Memphis, they would see each other, and the respect and love would always be there. Even if Dixie married someone else, and Elvis decided to quit the business and stay home and have children with her, well, she would just get a divorce. That's how much he meant to her. Less than a week after Dixie's junior prom, Elvis continued his pursuit of Anita Carter. On May 12th, they were at the Gator Bowl Stadium in Jacksonville, Florida. Elvis went on first, and when he came off stage, the Carter sisters were ready to follow. As usual, Elvis had worked up a sweat. He could literally lose several pounds in one performance. And as he passed by the Carters, he started stumbling and tottering around, finally collapsing in Anita's arms. A shout went up, and somebody laid Elvis out and said he was unconscious. Anita held his head in her lap and stroked his forehead, and the colonel ordered an ambulance to take him to the hospital. Red was worried as hell, as were Scotty and Bill and DJ, who was now working the road with them. They sat around in Red's hotel room, scared to death, wondering if he were dying from some mysterious disease, and awaiting word from the hospital. About 1 a.m., Red heard a knock on the door, and there stood Elvis, healthier than a herd of cattle, grinning from ear to ear. They pumped him full of questions, and he told them he was fine. Only when Scotty, Bill, and DJ went on to their rooms did Elvis say he'd faked the collapse just to get his head on Anita's lap. It wasn't true. He really was ill and running a fever from exhaustion. The emergency room doctor gave him a shot and suggested he take some time off. Instead, Elvis asked for a peanut butter and banana sandwich and concocted the story about faking the collapse out of embarrassment. But clearly he was infatuated with Anita, who faked her own collapse with Elvis sometime later. However, their relationship never really moved beyond flirtation. Elvis then turned his attention to Anita's older sister, June, whose marriage to country singer Carl Smith was in trouble. But June dismissed him out of hand. Elvis got a crush on whoever was handy. It was just his thing. He liked women. I decided I wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. Lord only knows where he'd been. He was a sexy man who really thought he could have any woman that he saw. But he couldn't, and I think that was a big shock to his ego. Elvis wasn't one to give up, though, and on a trip to Nashville with Red, he decided to look her up. As Red recounted the story in Elvis, What Happened, June was off at a gig, and so Elvis and Red simply forced a window in her Madison, Tennessee house and broke in to wait for her. They made themselves at home, fixing a meal in her copper pans and skillets, and ruining them in the process, and going to sleep, fully dressed and dirty, in the master bedroom. Carl came home the next morning, found the forced window and the messy kitchen, and like a scene from some hillbilly rendition of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, wondered, who's been breaking into my house? Who's been eating my food? And finally, who the hell is that sleeping in my bed? Elvis woke up and casually said, "Oh, hi, Carl." "You would have thought he would have chewed us out," Red wrote, "but he gave us a big hello and laughed. He showed us all around the big house. Smith had seen far crazier behavior from Nashville's honky-tonk crowd, and he took it all in stride. That night, when June and her sisters came home, they had a big Southern dinner and stayed up half the night talking and singing. I kept praying that story would never get out, June said. I saw Red right after he wrote it, and he said, June, I should never have put your name in there. I did everything I could so that people would know that you were really a good girl. And I appreciated Red doing that, but I didn't think it was anybody's business. Elvis was my friend. We had a lot of fun together. We sung late at night, playing the piano, but I wasn't going to run and jump and play with him like the other women, and he knew that. But he also knew that we were just real good friends, and we stayed that way. June and Carl Smith divorced in 1956, and June went out on the road doing shows with Elvis on her own. She was always sentimental about the experience. I've got 2 or 3 little notes and pictures that Elvis gave me, but she ended up with more than memories and souvenirs. Elvis introduced me to Johnny Cash's music. We would stop in all of the little restaurants down in the South to get something to eat, and he always played Johnny's records on the jukebox. He loved to hear him sing. He tried to sing all of his songs right in my ear, and I heard them over and over and over. Then John walked up to me one night in 1956, when I had come home from New York to do the Opry. He said, I'm Johnny Cash. I know you work with Elvis Presley. He's a friend of mine, and I would like to meet you. And I said, well, I should know you already, and I believe I do. I've had to listen to you enough. Their son, John Carter Cash, says that his mother would get a mischievous twinkle in her eye whenever she mentioned Elvis and told him, you know, son, your father was always jealous of Elvis. And so was Carl. Underneath his good humor about the break-in, there was tension. June kept a billboard poster of Smith on which Elvis had drawn a silly mustache and goofy glasses. Below it, he scribbled, painted by Presley. After Carl moved out of the house, June would sometimes let Elvis stay there to rest at the end of the tour. Like most children, John Carter wrote in Anchored in Love, a memoir of his mother. When I was young, I thought my mother was capable of doing no wrong. I know without a doubt that she was a good person of high standards and solid morals. On the other hand, she was being charmed by one of the greatest sex symbols of our time. The temptation to give in to his advances, at least in some small way, would have been tremendous. I have a hard time blaming her. On May 13th, the Hank Snow Jamboree Tour was back at the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville for a second night, with 14,000 screaming fans in attendance, nearly all of them there for Elvis. 2 nights earlier in Orlando, headliner Hank Snow found Elvis a hard act to follow, the girls yelling for Elvis to come back out on stage. Parker always denied that, insisting Hank Snow could follow anybody. He was a great artist. But Charlie Louvin, who with his brother Ira played Elvis dates on the snow shows, remembers it being true. Unlike Bob Neal, who never planted screamers, Parker wasn't just banking on throngs of hormonal teenagers. He helped orchestrate them. The Colonel sent Tom Diskin to Woolworth's to give kids free tickets to the shows. The only thing they had to do was scream, "We want Elvis." A professional act like Hank Snow or the Louvin brothers couldn't work with 100 kids hollering, "We want Elvis." Hank would sing 2 or 3 songs and then just say, "Hell, you can have Elvis." Farron Young, also on the Orlando bill, remembered that the announcer tried to subdue the crowd, telling the audience that Elvis was out back signing autographs, only to have the auditorium empty out. Possibly in deference to Snow, whose ego outsized his small frame, Elvis, sporting a pink lace shirt that looked like a woman's blouse, closed his Jacksonville set with the crack, "Girls, I'll see you all backstage." Before anyone knew how to stop it, a swath of frenzied teenagers broke through the police barricade and chased Elvis into the dugout locker room. Mae Bourne Axton, a 40-year-old Jacksonville schoolteacher who handled publicity on the show for her old friend Tom Parker, was sitting with the Colonel as he counted the money from the night's take. All of a sudden, I heard Elvis's voice shouting, "May, May, May!" I jumped up and ran down there, and so help me, about 500 kids had crawled under those pull-up doors. Elvis had climbed on top of the showers, and he was hanging there darn near naked. They'd torn his lace shirt apart, and everybody had pieces of his coat, and they even had his boots and socks off. By the time the police got things under control, Elvis, clad only in his pants, looked sheepish and scared. The police helped him down, but May found that quieting the crowd was another matter. I heard all this screaming, and I went up out of the dugout and saw this girl I had taught. I said, "Hey, honey, what's the matter?" "Oh, hi, Ms. Aston, boo-hoo-hoo-hoo." I said, "Wait a minute, what is it about this kid Elvis?" And she gave me one of the best definitions I've ever heard. She said, "Oh, Ms. Aston, he's just a great, big, beautiful hunk of forbidden fruit." The Jacksonville riot marked the first time the Colonel knew precisely what a gold mine he had in his new client. It also marked a turning point in the young life of 13-year-old Jackie Rowland, an Elvis fan who got backstage through the efforts of her grandfather, a policeman. Lying transfixed on the floor, eating a bowl of peanut butter and jelly mixed together, Jackie had watched Elvis on television. Weight had always been an issue for the 5-foot-tall teenager, and when she arrived at the Gator Bowl that night, she weighed 190 pounds. Wearing her blue Kirby Smith High School band sweater and a pair of blue suede shoes, I'm sure I must have looked like a giant blueberry, or maybe a grape. Backstage, Elvis signed her program and introduced her to the Carter sisters, and then talked to her longer than he did most of the girls. When it was time for her to go, he kissed her on the cheek. And of course I was in love. He was so handsome and so nice to me, and not condescending about my weight. It got her thinking, fantasizing about what it would be like to see him again, especially if she could diet herself down to the size of the other girls. If she lost weight, she asked her mother, Marguerite, could she go to Tennessee to see Elvis? "Sure," her mother said. "If you lose the weight, I will take you to Memphis." 2 months later, on July 28th and 29th, Elvis was back at the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville, and yet another riot ensued. Fellow performer Marty Robbins, who had joined the bill as a way to repay Colonel Parker for a favor, remembered it vividly. They really mobbed him. I couldn't imagine that happening. They chased him in the dressing room, underneath the stands in his shower room. He was on top of the showers trying to get away from people. Guys and girls alike were trying to grab a shoe, trying to grab just anything. Robbins knew for certain that Elvis was going to be completely irresistible to women because of what happened in the next town, Daytona Beach. When we went out on the beach to go swimming, the girls were all looking at him like, "Boy, there is something." He had everything in his favor. He had youth, he had good looks, he had talent, he was single, and then when he got Colonel Tom Parker on his side, that was it. He was the best manager a person could get. May Axton had also seen the reactions in Daytona Beach and Orlando. She'd worked all 3 cities after getting calls from Bob Neal and Sam Phillips, asking if she could help establish Elvis in the Florida markets. The daughter of a Texas rancher and confectionery shop owner, she was a big-hearted gal who dabbled in songwriting, freelance magazine writing, and promotion work to supplement her teaching job. As the mother of 2 sons, Johnny, 11, and 13-year-old Hoyt, later a singer-songwriter on his own, May had a soft spot for young men trying to make their way in the world. She also wanted to help Bob Neal, throwing in $50 of her PR money for Elvis's fee, and arranging for a free motel room in each of the 3 cities. Elvis called her when he got to the edge of Daytona Beach, and when she met him, she found herself instantly charmed. He had a quick, sensual smile that made him seem shy and vulnerable at the same time, and he was so sweet and polite and nice that you couldn't help but love the kid. I wanted to make things easy for him. They visited for a while, and then she had to do a radio interview, she said. but she told him to wait, that she wouldn't be gone long. When I came back, the other guys were down at the beach looking for the cute girls, but Elvis was leaning over the grill work on the balcony, staring at the ocean. I said, "Hi, honey, are you okay?" He said, "May, I can't get over this ocean." Now, he grew up on the mighty Mississippi, but he said, "It's so vast, just no end to it. I'd give anything in the world if I had enough money to bring my mama and daddy to Florida and let them see the ocean." It touched her that his priority was his parents, when most 20-year-olds would think about having fun. Later that year, she and Tommy Durden would write Elvis's breakthrough hit, Heartbreak Hotel, and she would let the Colonel cut Elvis in for a third of the writer's credit. He hadn't written one word, but just maybe Elvis would see enough royalties to make that Florida dream come true. More and more, Elvis relied on women behind the scenes, such as May Bourne-Axton and Marion Keisker, to create or advance some fundamental aspect of his career. Both May and Marion were mother figures, but not every woman who aided him would fall into that age group. On May 28, 1955, 16-year-old Kay Wheeler and her sister Linda huddled together in the darkness of their bedroom in Dallas, Texas. With their parents asleep, they turned their radio up as loud as they dared, hoping to pick up a rhythm and blues station that would let them hear something along the lines of Johnny Ace's Pledging My Love or the Penguins' languid Earth Angel. The Wheeler girls were white and lived in a typical 1950s brick tract house in a respectable middle-class neighborhood. But after their cousin, Diana, played them Little Mama by the Clovers, the Hank Ballard and the Midnighters' more risque Work With Me, Annie, they demanded more of their music than the vanilla hits of the day. And so they began making pilgrimages to buy rhythm and blues records at the Colored Record Store, riding the bus downtown, and walking self-consciously along a street lined with pawn shops, run-down stores, and hip Negro bucks who examined them with frank stares and amused grins, as Kay described in her book, Growing Up with the Memphis Flash. 55 years later, she still remembers the thrill. Here we were, these nice little suburb kids, smuggling these 78 RPM records into our room the way people would do drugs or something. And I guess we were. We were doing rock and roll. On that late spring night, glued to the radio, the Wheeler girls stumbled on a broadcast of the Big D Jamboree, a country radio hoedown show much like the Louisiana Hayride and the Grand Ole Opry. There, they heard an unknown song from an unknown singer who delivered a stuttering, hiccuping vocal of sexual threat. "I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to be with another man." The Wheelers caught their breath. That knife-point guitar, that doghouse bass. It wasn't quite blues, and it wasn't entirely hillbilly, but it sure got them way down deep. Kay turned up the volume to find out who and what it was. Elvis Presley with Baby Let's Play House. Kay looked at her sister. "I think I'm going to faint." She didn't, but she and Linda talked about him all night, wondering about his name. Had they heard it right? Was he colored or was he white? Then 2 weeks later, a girl at school started telling Kay all about how a guy named Elvis played in Gladewater, Texas, and nobody could hear a word he said. He was so good-looking and sexy, the girls screamed every single second. 5 months passed before Kay actually saw what he looked like, on a poster at the Melody Record Shop. He was leaning back with his pelvis tilted forward and his mouth wide open. Was he in pain? It was hard to tell. A lock of greasy hair fell on his forehead, and that cinched it. She had to have it. Kay felt her cheeks burn, but she was a tiny thing, size 4, so who would notice? She quickly removed the poster from the wall, put it in her bag, and walked out the door. At home, she and Linda shrieked with delight. God, he was a dream. "I'm going to meet him," Kay announced, and that was that. Her opportunity came a few days later, though it was indirect, unplanned, and would take some time. She was visiting her Aunt Billy, secretary to the president of KLIF, the popular top 40 radio station in Dallas. They were in Billy's office when DJ Bruce Hayes stopped by with a record in his hand. "Listen to this name, Elvis Presley," he said. "Have you ever heard anything so corny in your life?" Kay couldn't stand it. It was like making fun of him. I'd just gotten the poster, and we were flipping out over him, so I just blurted out in my antagonistic teenage way, "Well, he's going to be big. I've already got a fan club for him." It wasn't true, of course, but when Hayes asked her for her address on that Saturday afternoon, she gave it to him without thinking. And she never heard him announce, "If you want to join the Elvis Presley fan club, write to Kay Wheeler." The following Tuesday, she wasn't feeling well. I was good at playing hooky. If I had the least bit of cramps, I wouldn't go to school. And she was in the den, lazing around in her robe when her mother called her. "Kay, there are all these letters on the front porch in stacks, and they're all to you." "What?" There were hundreds of them, bundled together and tied with string, all of them asking about how to join the fan club, or wanting a card or a photo. I laid these letters on the floor, all across the room, and I just couldn't believe it. I was flabbergasted. It was a crazy moment, especially since I didn't have a fan club. But soon she would, sanctioned by Colonel Parker's office in Tennessee. It was like they courted me. Bob and Helen Neal had started the first regional fan club, but they didn't have the pink and black passion of a teenage girl with a poster of a prominent pelvis. Within weeks, Kay Wheeler would be the president of the first national Elvis Presley fan club, and no one could have guessed at the power of a 16-year-old Texas girl to muster the troops, which would soon be growing by the thousands every day. 7. Biloxi Bliss. On June 26, 1955, Elvis and the Blue Moon Boys played the Slavonian Lodge in Biloxi, Mississippi. The previous February, Elvis had appeared in 2 shows at the Jesuit High School auditorium in New Orleans, on a bill with 15-year-old Martha Ann Barhanovich, who briefly recorded for Decca under the name of Ann Ray. Her father, Frank Yankee Barhanovich, a district manager for the American National Insurance Company, moonlighted as a talent booker, mostly because Martha hoped to make a career out of singing. After the Jesuit shows, for which both performers were paid $150, the teenaged Martha begged her father to bring Elvis to Biloxi, where the Barhanoviches lived. Daddy was booking all these people not as young as Elvis, and well, I just knew he needed to book him for people my age. And so the elder Barhanovich brought Elvis to the area for 3 nights that summer, the first at the Slavonian Lodge, named for the people of South Slavic origin, the Croatians who populated the region and dominated the oyster and shrimp trade. The local newspaper, running a story in advance of the show, reported that it was expected to be a sellout, given Elvis's popularity on the hayride, and since the teenagers just love him. Salvador Penu Taranto, a member of Johnny Elmer's Rockets, which often brought 300 to 400 kids into the lodge, was there that night, and he was blown away. He'd heard Elvis on the jukebox, but he was unprepared for a full show of music that would soon be termed rockabilly. It was so different from any type of music that you couldn't even relate to it at the time. Here was everybody making fun of this guy, shaking like he had something wrong with him. But what he did good. When he popped that first hit, he really took off. The following day, 17-year-old June Wanaco had just gotten home from work when she got a call from her girlfriend, Glenda Manduffy, who had attended the show at the tiny lodge. She was practically screaming into the phone about this guy Elvis Presley and the way he moved, and how it was wall-to-wall females in the place, and she couldn't get close enough to him to really see him. But he was going to be at the Airmen's Club at Keesler Air Force Base that night, and the next. And come on, June, let's go. June thought about it a minute. She had a steady boyfriend, the 6'4" Norby Ron Sonnet, and you were supposed to be 18 years old to get into this place, but reluctantly she went. She'd already heard other people say, "You need to go and see him," and so she caved. She called Norby and told him she had to go somewhere with her friend and that they'd be late getting in. The first time she'd ever heard of Elvis, she was listening to the radio. That's All Right Mama came on, and then later, Good Rockin' Tonight. My first thought was that he was a nervous old man, an elderly hillbilly. When June and her friend got to the club, they saw maybe 35 women in a sea of airmen. They picked a table right by the stage because Glenda kept saying, "Wait till you see this guy, he's so good-looking." To really get a good look at him, June realized they needed to be on the dance floor, since the couples would block their view between the table and the stage. She was skeptical about him, this nervous, old guy, but when he finally came out, her jaw dropped. I thought he was the most gorgeous thing I'd ever seen. Elvis noticed her, too. He picked her out of the crowd, her suntan showing off her white dress as she danced. Still, she didn't go over to him during intermission when he stood and talked to a clutch of folks, mostly airmen. "Come on, Glenda," she said, orchestrating a game of cat and mouse. "Let's go to the ladies' room." When they passed by him, he and June exchanged brief eye contact. Then, as the girls made their way back to the table, Elvis reached through the swarm and grabbed her by the arm. "Where are you going? You're not leaving, are you?" It was the first time she'd really looked into his face, and she just about died. He had those big, dreamy eyes, but he didn't look like anyone she had ever seen either. His voice, laced with Memphis twang, was playful and seductive, a mix of little boy charm and adult sensuality, but he also seemed like a gentleman. "No," she said, "I'm going back to my table." "I'll get through here in about an hour. Will you stay until I get off? Then you can show me the town." She felt herself getting goosebumps, but she didn't want to show it. She'd never even kissed on a first date, and she didn't want to send the wrong message. She hadn't screamed at his performance like the other girls. "Well," she said, "Biloxi is such a small town, there's really nothing to see." "Oh, really? Well, show me what there is to see." He promised he'd take good care of her, and he could see by the look on her face that she thought it was all happening too quickly. He said, "In this business, if I meet somebody and I don't make a fast move, I'm not going to make a move at all. I may never see you again." She was excited and scared, but she heard herself say okay. And after his second set was over and he loaded up the equipment, he pulled around front in his parents' pink and black Crown Victoria with a bass strapped on the top. She'd never seen anything like that. It made the car look like a tank with a gun turret. "I have to go back to the motel real quick to change clothes," he said. And when they got there, he didn't invite her in. The room's a mess. She sat there a few minutes wondering if she'd done the right thing in even coming. And then Scotty and Bill came out of the room and stood on either side of the car. It frightened her. She didn't know they were just getting the bass down. And then, finally, Elvis came out, and they went to Gus Stevens's restaurant to see comedian Dave Gardner do the floor show. They stayed a long time, just listening to music, but they were both underage. Elvis was still just 20. So they left before anybody found out, and went and parked at the pier at the White House Hotel. They talked in the car for a while, and then he wanted to go for a walk. He took her hand, and there was just enough moonlight that she could watch for the cracks in the pier's old boards, so her high heels wouldn't get stuck. Suddenly, he stopped. He turned her around so he was behind her and slipped his hands around her waist and kissed her neck. She felt a shock of electricity and squirmed, but he promised he wouldn't hurt her. He kissed her tenderly, first her forehead and each eye, then her nose, and finally her lips. She kissed him back in a way that had a future in it. "Where did you learn to kiss?" he asked, surprised at her passion. "I was just getting ready to ask you the same thing," she said, and she still remembers what it was like. Soft, full lips, nothing too sloppy. Oh, it was just marvelous. A little pecking here and there, a nibble, and then a serious bite. It started small and then got bigger, and then went little again before ending up with a lot of eye contact. They sat on the end of the pier and talked and smooched and talked and smooched and said the usual things that young lovers do about not wanting to be any other place in the world in that minute. Then she thought about what her mother always told her about being in a compromised position and got her wits about her and asked what time it was. Elvis tried to look at his watch, but the moon was so pale he couldn't tell if it was 1:15 or 3:05. It was definitely past her curfew, though, and she said, "Oh, my God, my mother's going to kill me. I'm always home by midnight." They parked outside her mother's house, and it was just supposed to be for a minute. "Do you have to go in?" he asked, his voice saying he hoped she didn't. "Well, not yet," she told him. "But if that light comes on right there in the corner of the house, I've got to run." The light never blinked, but June knew her mother kept an eye out to see what they were doing. She didn't care. She just wanted to talk to him. It was 6 a.m. when she finally got out of the car, an 8-hour date. By that time, they'd talked about everything. He was shocked that her parents were divorced. He thought of marriage as a lifelong commitment, he said, and when he got married, it was going to last forever. And he told her all about his twin, who died at birth. "By the way," she said, "what's your real name?" "What do you mean, my real name? My name is Elvis Aaron Presley." She'd never met anybody quite like him. Now she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about his face, the way it looked the first time she saw it up close. She wasn't sure what she was feeling, but it was wonderful, and she wished she could keep it forever. He said he had shows in Mobile, but he would phone her when he got back to Memphis. But each time he placed his person-to-person call, some guy answered the phone, and Elvis didn't know what was up, didn't realize it was June's brother Jerry, who didn't tell her that she'd gotten a call and that she was supposed to phone the operator back to be connected. June prided herself on being feisty and independent. I wasn't staying home monitoring the phone. And she didn't tell a soul about her date with Elvis. It was too surreal, and deep down, she wanted it all to have meant as much to him as it did to her. She didn't want to make a fool of herself. Over and over, lying in bed, she heard what he'd said when she asked him what it felt like to perform like that, to walk out on stage and have the entire place go wild, to shake all over and have all the girls screaming with just a toss of his head. "I can't explain it," he said. "Maybe something like sex, but not exactly." Gosh, she thought, that many orgasms would kill a person. In July 1955, 17-year-old country singer Wanda Jackson had just graduated from high school in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and already she'd had her own radio show and enjoyed a national hit, "You Can't Have My Love," a duet with Billy Gray, the band leader for Western swing king Hank Thompson. Her father, Tom, who watched his dreams of becoming a singer crumble during the Depression, managed her, and her mother designed and sewed her stage outfits, which in time went to gold lame and shimmering sequins. "I was the first one to put some glamour in the country music. Fringe dresses, high heels, long earrings," she says. With a bewitching beauty and a surplus of sass, she was turning heads all across the Southwest. Bob Neal had had his eye on the dark-haired teen for some time, and that summer, he tapped her for a 2-day package show with Elvis. When her father accepted the booking, one night in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and a second in Newport, Arkansas, Wanda had no idea who Elvis Presley was, since Oklahoma City wasn't playing his records. But Tom Jackson, going by what Bob Neal had reported, told her Elvis was getting popular real fast. She met him at Cape Girardeau radio station on the afternoon of July 20th, and I was quite impressed. A real handsome guy. He dressed a little flashier than the guys back home in Oklahoma, yellow coat, for example. And when he left the station, she saw him get into a pink car. I had never seen a pink car, so I knew that he was different. The first night, Wanda and her father were in her dressing room when Elvis went on. All of a sudden, my dad and I started hearing this screaming. I mean, really screaming, just constant. My dad said, "Well, golly, I wonder if there's a fire or something. Let me go look." I started getting my coat and my purse, and he came back and said, "Now, relax, but you've got to see this for yourself. You'll never believe it." He took me to the wings, and there was Elvis singing and moving and gyrating, and all these girls standing at the foot of the stage, screaming and reaching for him. We had never seen anything like that. It seemed sexy, but I don't think he was trying to be vulgar, because he was flirty with the girls down front. He'd look at them, and they'd scream, and he'd shake at them, and then they'd squeal. He was just having fun. They worked together again for 4 days in August, through Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas, and then went out on a week-long tour in October, swinging through Texas and Oklahoma with Johnny Cash, now one of Sam's son artists, and newcomer Porter Wagner. Wanda found Elvis fun to be around. On those tours, all us artists would keep something going to make each other laugh, and he laughed all the time. He didn't take himself seriously. Somewhere along the miles, they started dating, finding they had the same appreciation for simple pleasures. If we could get in a town early, and it was large enough to have a movie theater, we'd go to a matinee, and then after a show, we'd go out to eat, usually with Scotty and Bill and my daddy. Then sometimes we'd get a hamburger and just drive around the town and talk. Then, after the tour, she'd go home to Oklahoma City, and he to Memphis. But they talked on the phone almost every day. Being able to know him and know his heart made me admire him a lot, and certainly his entertaining and music abilities knocked me out. In a sense, they recognized themselves in each other. She had the same sultry eyes and full lips, and his career was just beginning to blossom, and mine was too. He was just a fine person, and he was never out of the way at all with me. Treated me just like a lady. What impressed Wanda most was the fact that Elvis took such an interest in advancing her career. He kept telling her that a lot of girls could sing country, not that she wasn't great at it, but no girl was doing rockabilly, and she should give it a try. He was just really eager that I try this kind of music like he was doing. I'd say, "But Elvis, I'm just a country singer. I can't sing songs like that." He'd say, "You can too. I know you can. You've just got to try." So he took me to his home, and we played old black blues records, and he sang to me and tried to show me the feel for it. Few performers of either gender ever got such specific musical advice from Elvis. The following year, Wanda signed with Capitol Records and took his advice, writing her own Spitfire songs, "Mean, Mean Man," "Rock Your Baby," because no other girls were singing rockabilly. I was the first one. In time, Wanda would become the preeminent woman of the genre, the queen of rockabilly. She fearlessly explored the cracks between country and rock and roll, and in such songs as "Let's Have a Party," she snarled with low-class abandon about female lust. "The meat is on the stove, the bread's a-gettin' hot. Everybody run, they got the possum in the pot." Like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Elvis's early hero back in Tupelo, she was ahead of her time, carving out a niche as the first white girl to do raunchy rock and roll like the guys did. Her Fujiyama Mama even hit #1 in Japan. However, not everyone was ready for such a femme fatale. On her one Grand Ole Opry performance, Ernest Tubb found her bombshell appearance so provocative, he forced her to wear a coat over her spaghetti-strap dress. "I didn't consider myself a rebel at all," she says. "I wasn't even very familiar with the term." But Elvis, who saw her as his musical peer, if also another replacement for his lost twin, understood it perfectly. She would soon be known as the female Elvis. Within a few months of meeting, he gave her one of his rings. A man's ring. It had little chipped diamonds. He wasn't very rich at that point. We were in Shreveport, Louisiana, and he asked me if I'd step outside with him. We went over and stood by his car, and he asked me if I'd be his girl. I had a crush on him, so I said yes, of course, and I wore the ring for about a year. It was a precious time. But things were happening so fast for both of them, and by then, there were so many girls, and so many rings. It was almost hard for Elvis to keep them straight. In the fall of 1955, Elvis was back in Biloxi, playing 3 nights there, 2 shows at the Biloxi Community House on November 6th, and return engagements at the Airmen's Club on November 7th and 8th. He'd kept trying to get in touch with June Wanaco, but without success. The same guy kept answering the phone, and Elvis kept leaving messages, but June never called back. Elvis was not the only performer to be playing Biloxi twice that year. Over at the Biloxi Beach Club, a sticky strip joint, 17-year-old Tura Santana entertained the men, mostly sailors and winter tourists, with her exotic dance routine. I had so much fun with those Navy men, Tura remembers. I'd slide up to the end of the stage and say, "Okay, who's first?" Her specialty was tassel twirling. She had such good muscle control she could twirl while lying flat on her back, and even twirl in opposite directions, one at a time, switching off. Sometimes she'd snatch the blushing sailors' hats right off their heads and twirl them too, and the whole place would go nuts. "Someday I'm gonna fly if I can get enough RPMs," she'd yell to whoops and hollers. She would eventually be rated the top tassel twirler in the world. Tura may have been young, but she had already lived a lifetime. Born Tura Luna Pascal Yamaguchi in 1938, she was the daughter of a silent film actor of Japanese and Filipino heritage and a Native American circus performer. She spent her childhood in Manzanar, a Japanese internment camp near Lone Pine, California, and after World War II, the family relocated to the west side of Chicago. Unlike most Asians, Tura developed a voluptuous figure and blossomed early. At 10, while walking home from school, she was attacked and gang-raped by 5 boys in an alley, probably as a hate crime toward the Japanese. One of them, she says, was a cousin of the policeman sent to investigate, and the judge looked the other way. She ended up in reform school for tempting those boys into raping me, and was classified as a juvenile delinquent. Afterward, her father taught her martial arts as a way to protect herself, but her anger still festered. She became the leader of a vigilante girl gang. We had leather motorcycle jackets, jeans, and boots, and we kicked butt, and patrolled the neighborhood to make sure the streets were safe for women. At 13 and already 5'7", the geisha beauty married 17-year-old John Santana in a union arranged by her parents. 9 months later, she took off for Los Angeles. There, she filled her days modeling bathing suits and posing nude for silent screen comic and 3D photographer Harold Lloyd, and by night she worked as a cigarette girl at the Trocadero, the famed Sunset Strip celebrity hangout. Before long, she was back in Chicago, living with her parents and dancing in clubs, first as an interpretive dancer, and then, when she was offered more money to take off her clothes, as a stripper. She quickly perfected her exotic dancing, learning some of her shimmies from her mother, who taught her to fast hula to the Hawaiian war chant. Soon she was traveling the club circuit with her elaborately beaded costumes and hand-painted kimonos, all of which eventually came off to reveal a string and pasties. And things got hotter. She carried a prop Buddha, whose hands burst into flames when she brushed against his palms. "When I was dancing," she says, "burlesque was an art, classy and elegant and requiring talent. In time, she would be voted one of the best burlesque dancers of the century and parlay her talents into a film career, most memorably as the leather-clad Varla in Russ Meyer's 1965 cult classic, Faster Pussycat, Kill, Kill, an homage to female violence. Film critic Richard Corliss described her performance, for which she did all her own stunts and fight scenes, as the most honest, maybe the one honest portrayal in the Meyer canon, and certainly the scariest. Not surprising, the butch villain was a character she helped to create. The night that 20-year-old Elvis first returned to Biloxi, he was too keyed up after his shows to sleep and wandered into the rough-and-tumble Biloxi Beach Club. There, he watched the young hoochie-coochie dancer on stage. Remembering the time he saw Gypsy Rose Lee at the Cotton Carnival in Memphis, Elvis was fascinated by the way Tura moved her body, the way she held the lubricated sailors as sexual hostages. He saw how she tantalized them with each suggestion of undress, and how they lost their minds when she rolled her breasts around in her hands, spinning the little twirlers at the nipples. Sultry, sassy, and exotic, Tura Santana was nothing like any girl Elvis had known. The hayride girls were either shy virgins who hoped for a kiss, or hungry country girls who'd had plenty of quick sex out behind the barn. But Tura was a mistress of seduction, and she was gorgeous, her dark hair piled high on her head. He went backstage to see her and introduce himself, saying he was a performer himself just up the road, in town for only a few days. She was smoking and drinking too freely from a paper cup, and my God, her breasts were still pretty much hanging out, and her derriere, too. She looked like a hooker. "My mama wouldn't want me in a place like this," he said later, but she seemed like a lady underneath all that, and he wanted to ask some questions about the way she moved. And so, as he had done with June Wanaco, he asked if they could take a walk on the beach. Tura sized him up. She liked his features, his beautiful blue eyes and blonde hair, greased dark, and he seemed harmless. Besides, she could take care of herself, and so she said yes. He flirted with her along the way. "It's dangerous for a beautiful lady like you to walk out here alone," he said. "Oh, is it?" she flirted back. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You shouldn't do this alone. Somebody might hassle you." "Well," she countered, "what about you?" They were both into it now, though she'd never been called ma'am before. "Nobody will hassle me," he insisted. "Really?" "No, nobody will hassle me." They walked for a long time, and eventually he made his move. Some light kissing and touching, but it never got out of hand. Mostly they sat on the beach and talked until long after the sun came up. He told her about his mother, and said he'd been traveling a lot the last year, meeting a lot of different people. He could hardly believe where a song and a guitar had taken him. Then he asked her about her life, and she told him about all of it, even the nightmare parts. He wanted to know about Hollywood, too, and what it was like out there. And then he asked about her work, about dancing. She told him she'd been doing it only about a year, working out of New Orleans, but she'd seen some things, too, that was for sure. If the owners of the clubs knew she was underage, they'd have a heart attack. He asked about the men who came to see her and how she felt about that. She told him she made them part of her routine, that she joked with them, saying, "Okay, where have you got your hands right now?" Of course, there was always one who yelled out, "I wish you were my mother," and she'd predictably say, "Yeah, and you'd still be a breast baby, wouldn't you?" It always drew a laugh. Finally, she told him, "I have to go. I've got shows tonight." And he said, "I do too." Then he told her he was in Shreveport most Saturday nights appearing on the hayride. He asked how to get in touch with her and said he'd invite her to one of the shows. His mom came down sometimes, and he wanted them to meet, though already he was thinking he didn't want Gladys to see Tura as some little tramp. Tura said that she played in Shreveport too, and it would be great to meet his mother. She sounded like a lovely lady, and he was such a good-looking guy, she thought, and so nice. So yeah, maybe they would get together. Maybe they would. The fall of 1955 brought so many big changes that Elvis seemed to be in a daze half the time. The Presleys had moved to another rental house, this one at 1414 Getwell, where they paid $85 a month. It was right around the corner from where they'd been on Lamar, but Elvis was on the road so much that Vernon and Gladys had to pack the boxes and wrestle with the furniture without him. The biggest shifts were in his professional life, and Elvis was torn about some of them. His hayride contract was renewed at $200 an appearance, a jump of more than 1,000%. The Colonel didn't want him in that deal and advised against it, but Vernon insisted, who knew how long this gravy train would run. And Scotty and Bill had convinced him to add drummer DJ Fontana full-time, and Elvis wasn't sure that was the right thing to do either, especially since the Colonel hammered him to drop Scotty and Bill altogether. Even more troubling, Parker had steamrollered everybody in moving Elvis's career forward. The cigar-chomping impresario had pretty much squeezed Bob Neal out of the picture now, though Bob and Helen loved Elvis so much they continued to co-sign for what was becoming Elvis's fleet of Cadillacs, some pink, some yellow. And Sam Phillips, too, was about to be left in the dust, the Colonel finalizing his deal to get Elvis off of Sun Records and on to RCA. Sam was philosophical about it. With a buyout of $35,000, an astronomical and unheard-of price at the time, he could sign and promote a number of new artists. He already had several in the wings. Carl Perkins's Blue Suede Shoes was about to be released, and Sam was also giving more attention to developing Johnny Cash. He hadn't planned on turning 100% of his talents over to Elvis, especially since every Elvis session was arduous and took a great deal of time. Besides, tension had been mounting in the Sun and the Elvis camp for several months, ever since Colonel Parker's involvement. The Colonel had completely won Vernon over to his side, telling him money would rain from the sky once Parker got Elvis moved to RCA, and Vernon had been antagonistic with Sam and Marion both. Marion remembered back to the beginning, when Elvis's first release came out, and he stood there with a record in his hand and his eyes full of tears. He was so happy and humble, saying, "To think this has happened to me. This is what I've always wanted all my life, my very own record with my very own name on it." Now, under the suggestions of Colonel Tom, Vernon had become very difficult, and of course Elvis didn't want to do anything his father disapproved of, which put him under great stress. There were other good reasons to let him go, too. Elvis, being young and full of piss and vinegar, seemed accident-prone. He'd already had several wrecks in his Cadillacs, and the 1954 model, which he'd had painted pink, caught fire and burned near Hope, Arkansas, after a rear wheel bearing locked up. Elvis was in the caddy with the date, and when Bill and Scotty caught up with him, the latter remembers, he was on the side of the road, frantically emptying the trunk, throwing guitars and amplifiers and clothes. And now he was riding motorcycles, partly in emulation of Marlon Brando and James Dean, though he'd pick up the habit from Jimmy Rogers Snow, Hank's son, with whom he often went riding in Nashville, where people tended not to recognize him. "I had 2 motorcycles, and he really loved just taking off and going riding a lot," says Snow. But to Sam's point of view, it meant that one day he could have a multi-million-dollar property, and the next day he could have nothing. Once, during a terrible storm, Marion heard someone calling her name. There was Elvis, careening down Union Avenue on a motorcycle with a girl on the back. Didn't the boy have enough sense not to take that thing out in the rain? Even through the transition, though, Elvis and Marion remained friends. He seemed loath to cut his ties with her, and just happened to be in the neighborhood all too often. Marion was busier than she'd ever been, since Sam planned to use part of his buyout money to realize another of his dreams, to establish an all-girl radio station, WHER. It signed on almost immediately, at the end of October 1955, and Marion oversaw nearly all the operations, helping Sam set it up and making its first announcement on the air. Now she had 3 jobs, and often she fell asleep at her desk. One morning, about 3 o'clock, she faintly heard someone yelling, "Marion! Marion!" I looked up, and Elvis was standing there absolutely white as a ghost. He was passing by on his motorcycle and had seen me through the blinds, and he was really upset and shaky. He said, "Marion, I thought you were dead." She was going to miss that boy. On November 21st, 1955, all the parties, even Bob Neal, met at Sun and signed the final contract, the Colonel patting Gladys on the back as she gave her son a kiss. But Gladys didn't trust the Colonel, and he knew it. That's why he sent Hank Snow, his business partner, to sweet-talk Gladys into letting Elvis sign the management contract, having already used Jimmy Rogers Snow to bond with Elvis for the same goal. Basically, we were about the same age, and I carried the first good intention contract to Lubbock, Texas, where I met Elvis and was put on the same show with him to discuss the idea of him signing with Jamboree Attractions. I didn't know enough about what was going on to honestly know what was happening, if you know what I mean. I was just a teenager. The elder Snow assumed, of course, that Presley would be signed to the agency he jointly owned with Parker. But when the Colonel traveled to Memphis, he took 2 contracts with him that day. One bound Elvis to Hank Snow Enterprises, Jamboree Attractions, but the other exclusively to Parker. It was the second one the Colonel got the Presleys to sign, effectively swindling Snow out of half of Elvis's earnings for life. Gladys had no knowledge of any such chicanery. She just wasn't sure which she feared most, what Parker was going to turn the boy into or what might happen to him on his own. Her fears were not unjustified. Already, the floor had collapsed at a show in Bono, Arkansas, and more than one man had been overheard saying things like, "I'd better not see any girlfriend of mine going up after an autograph from that singer." Things had gotten much rougher at Elvis's appearance at the Rio Palm Isle Club in Longview, Texas, in August 1955, when a trucker went to the parking lot to look for his wife, who had somehow disappeared after Elvis's performance. They'd been there with another couple, and Elvis had flirted with the women throughout his songs, giving them that sizzling, sultry look from the stage. As Stanley Oberst and Laurie Torrance wrote in Elvis in Texas, The Undiscovered King, 1954 through 1958. They giggled like teenagers, their husbands just rolling their eyes. The trucker thought that perhaps his wife had gotten sick afterward, but she wasn't in the women's room. So, in Oberst and Torrance's account, he decided to check the car, his friend following him for a breath of air and a smoke. As they approached the car, they noticed a stranger glancing out the window and then disappearing. The 2 increased their speed and ripped open the door. His wife screamed from the passenger side and dove for the petticoats and the floorboards. Elvis fell onto the dirt parking lot, struggling to zip up. The trucker reached down with huge burly arms and grabbed the skinny frame, shaking the stuffing out of it and driving in a couple of well-placed right hooks. "Not my face, not my face," the singer yelled, covering the aforementioned location. "I've got to go back and play." The truck driver got in a few more gut-busters, then let his quarry flee back to the club. Grover Lewis, the late master of new journalism, witnessed a similar, if not the same, situation that year. He was in college at North Texas State and knew Elvis from the Big D Jamboree. As one of the only serious writers at North Texas at the time, the other was Larry McMurtry. He was always looking for guys like Marlon Brando and James Dean, who spoke uniquely to people our age, our generation, and Elvis qualified. He had that dangerous sense. As such, Lewis became acutely attuned to Elvis's sensual, raw, and bluish music, having grown up with strict segregation in small towns around Dallas and Fort Worth. In 1955, then, he went to a number of Elvis's shows around the region. Lewis could not precisely remember where he saw Elvis take a beating, though it might have been the M.B. Corral in Wichita Falls in April 1955. Nearly 40 years later, in 1994, Lewis described it as a country place somewhere near Wichita Falls. It was one of those places that had a barn dance ambiance, but it was an old World War II hangar that somebody had dragged out into a wet part of the country. If there was a headliner that night, it would have been him. He was dressed like a cowboy country singer and already driving a Cadillac, though old and rusted out. The budding reporter was fascinated both by Elvis and by the phenomenon he represented, because he virtually epitomized the Southern high school hood. On this night, and I believe it was a weeknight, he got up and was doing his act, singing country songs, and he began to make eyes at a young woman who was sitting close to the front with her boyfriend. The boyfriend was a big, tough oil field worker, a roughneck type. One of the guys seated at the table went to the restroom, and Elvis made goo-goo eyes at this girl and then made signals, which I could follow, to meet him in the parking lot. I suspect he was feeling magically charmed around that time, and there was a recklessness about it. In other words, Elvis was full of his own sexy charisma, and thought he could get away with it. And the girl was more than willing. Lewis trailed Elvis and the girl out to the parking lot just to see what would happen. I knew very likely that there would be a fight, and in fact, a fight is what happened. The roughneck came back to the table, discovered that his girlfriend was gone, waited around for her, and then went looking for her. He discovered them out in Elvis's Cadillac, smooching. I don't know if it went any further than that because I didn't get close enough to see, but the guy hauled Elvis out of the car and just literally beat the hell out of him, just beat him bloody. In fact, he didn't play anymore for the rest of the evening. He got his butt tromped. Even without jealous husbands and boyfriends, Elvis was getting so big now that anything could happen at any time, even a repeat of the Jacksonville, Florida riots. Without meaning to, the crowds could tear him apart like jackals on a rabbit. The fan reaction was so intense, so out of control, it was frightening just to be seen with him, even in Memphis. Marion had witnessed it herself. WHER had a broadcast booth at the Mid-South Fair that fall, and Marion was on her way one day, walking from her home. All of a sudden, this car pulls over to the curb, and there's Elvis, all shining and resplendent. Since he never passed up a gal walking down the street without some kind of greeting, he said, "Hop in, Marion." So I did. What girl could resist a hop-in invitation from Elvis? We decided to go to the fair together, and we parked out in the back and started walking. Suddenly, I realized we weren't alone, and I began to hear these cries of, "It's him! No, it's not him! Oh, it is him! I tell you, it's him!" Well, the crowd started to swell up like sugar candy on a cone, and this one strange little girl was clinging to him. I don't know what she was asking him, but she kept on, "Will you please, Elvis, will you please?" And she wouldn't let go. Finally, I took her hands and said, "Okay," he promised. Someone said, "Who's she?" And Elvis said, "This is my wife." It was the wildest thing, and you never heard such a to-do and carrying on. As we moved through the fairgrounds, we picked up a constantly growing entourage. We finally got to a booth where Elvis said he was going to win me a teddy bear. He started pitching balls, and he won me a teddy bear the very first throw. The lady who was operating the stand handed it to me, and before my arms could close around it, the bear went whish. All of a sudden it was gone. The little girl snatched it, so Elvis said, "Okay, I'll win you another bear." And he did, and the same thing happened. I promptly lost 3 teddy bears. By this time, the crowd had closed in, and they were pressing me so hard against the booth that my shin bones were about to crack on the planks that ran across the front. We were in such peril that the owners helped us leap across the counter. We went under the canvas in the back and raced madly for the front gate and got in a police car. They whisked us around the corner to where Elvis's car was parked, but the whole thing left me bruised and battered and without any of the teddy bears. It was certainly a horrible example of what can happen if you're out with a personality like Elvis and get caught up in a fan mob, Marion thought. After that, I never wanted to be seen with him in public again.